Adjustment team. Something went wrong, and Ed Fletcher got mixed up in the biggest thing in his life. It was bright morning. The sun shone down on the damp lawns and sidewalks, reflecting off the sparkling parked cars. The clerk came walking hurriedly, leafing through his instructions, flipping pages and frowning. He stopped in front of the small green stucco house for a moment, and then turned up the walk, entering the backyard. The dog was asleep inside his shed, his back turned to the world. Only his thick tail showed. "For heaven's sake," the clerk exclaimed, hands on his hips. He tapped his mechanical pencil noisily against his clipboard. "Wake up, you in there." The dog stirred. He came slowly out of his shed, head first, blinking and yawning in the morning sunlight. "Oh, it's you. Already?" He yawned again. "Big doings." The clerk ran his expert finger down the traffic control sheet. "They're adjusting sector T-137 this morning. Starting at exactly 9 o'clock. He glanced at his pocket watch. 3-hour alteration. We'll finish by noon. T-137. That's not far from here." The clerk's lips twisted in contempt. "Indeed. You're showing astonishing perspicacity, my black-haired friend. Maybe you can divine why I'm here. We overlap with T-137. Exactly. Elements from this sector are involved. We must make sure they're properly placed when adjustment begins." The clerk glanced toward the small green stucco house. "Your particular task concerns the man in there. He is employed by a business establishment lying within sector T-137. It's essential he be there before 9 o'clock. The dog studied the house. The shades had been let up. The kitchen light was on. Beyond the lace curtains dim shapes could be seen, stirring around the table. A man and woman. They were drinking coffee. "There they are," the dog murmured. "The man, you say? He's not going to be harmed, is he?" "Of course not. But he must be at his office early. Usually he doesn't leave until after 9. Today he must leave at 8:30. He must be within sector T-137 before the process begins, or he won't be altered to coincide with the new adjustment." The dog sighed. "That means I have to summon." "Correct." The clerk checked his instruction sheet. "You're to summon at precisely 8:15. You've got that?" 8:15. No later. What will an 8:15 summons bring? The clerk flipped open his instruction book, examining the code columns. "It will bring a friend with a car. To drive him to work early." He closed the book and folded his arms, preparing to wait. That way he'll get to his office almost an hour ahead of time. "Which is vital." "Vital," the dog murmured. He lay down, half inside his shed. His eyes closed. "Vital. Wake up. This must be done exactly on time. If you summon too soon or too late." The dog nodded sleepily. "I know. I'll do it right. I always do it right." Ed Fletcher poured more cream in his coffee. He sighed, leaning back in his chair. Behind him the oven hissed softly, filling the kitchen with warm fumes. The yellow overhead light beamed down. "Another roll?" Ruth asked. "I'm full." Ed sipped his coffee. "You can have it." "Have to go." Ruth got to her feet, unfastening her robe. "Time to go to work." "Already?" "Sure. You lucky bum. Wish I could sit around." Ruth moved toward the bathroom, running her fingers through her long black hair. "When you work for the government you start early." "But you get off early," Ed pointed out. He unfolded the Chronicle, examining the sporting green. "Well, have a good time today. Don't type any wrong words, any double entendres." The bathroom door closed, as Ruth shed her robe and began dressing. Ed yawned and glanced up at the clock over the sink. Plenty of time. Not even 8. He sipped more coffee and then rubbed his stubbled chin. He would have to shave. He shrugged lazily. 10 minutes, maybe. Ruth came bustling out in her nylon slip, hurrying into the bedroom. I'm late. She rushed rapidly around, getting into her blouse and skirt, her stockings, her little white shoes. Finally she bent over and kissed him. Goodbye, honey. I'll do the shopping tonight. Goodbye. Ed lowered his newspaper and put his arm around his wife's trim waist, hugging her affectionately. You smell nice. Don't flirt with the boss. Ruth ran out the front door, clattering down the steps. He heard the click of her heels diminish down the sidewalk. She was gone. The house was silent. He was alone. Ed got to his feet, pushing his chair back. He wandered lazily into the bathroom and got his razor down. 8:10. He washed his face, rubbing it down with shaving cream, and began to shave. He shaved leisurely. He had plenty of time. The clerk bent over his round pocket watch, licking his lips nervously. Sweat stood out on his forehead. The second hand ticked on. 8:14. Almost time. Get ready, the clerk snapped. He tensed, his small body rigid. 10 seconds to go. Time, the clerk cried. Nothing happened. The clerk turned, eyes wide with horror. From the little shed a thick black tail showed. The dog had gone back to sleep. Time, the clerk shrieked. He kicked wildly at the furry rump. In the name of God. The dog stirred. He thumped around hastily, backing out of the shed. My goodness. Embarrassed, he made his way quickly to the fence. Standing up on his hind paws, he opened his mouth wide. Woof, he summoned. He glanced apologetically at the clerk. I beg your pardon. I can't understand how. The clerk gazed fixedly down at his watch. Cold terror knotted his stomach. The hands showed 8:16. You failed, he grated. You failed. You miserable flea-bitten ragbag of a worn-out old mutt. You failed. The dog dropped and came anxiously back. I failed, you say. You mean the summons time was? You summoned too late. The clerk put his watch away slowly, a glazed expression on his face. You summoned too late. We won't get a friend with a car. There's no telling what will come instead. I'm afraid to see what 8:16 brings. I hope he'll be in Sector T-137 in time. He won't, the clerk wailed. He won't be there. We've made a mistake. We've made things go wrong. Ed was rinsing the shaving cream from his face when the muffled sound of the dog's bark echoed through the silent house. Damn, Ed muttered. Wake up the whole block. He dried his face, listening. Was somebody coming? A vibration. Then. The doorbell rang. Ed came out of the bathroom. Who could it be? Had Ruth forgotten something? He tossed on a white shirt and opened the front door. A bright young man, face bland and eager, beamed happily at him. Good morning, sir. He tipped his hat. I'm sorry to bother you so early. What do you want? I'm from the Federal Life Insurance Company. I'm here to see you about. Ed pushed the door closed. Don't want any. I'm in a rush. Have to get to work. Your wife said this was the only time I could catch you. The young man picked up his briefcase, easing the door open again. She especially asked me to come this early. We don't usually begin our work at this time, but since she asked me, I made a special note about it. Okay. Sighing wearily, Ed admitted the young man. You can explain your policy while I get dressed. The young man opened his briefcase on the couch, laying out heaps of pamphlets and illustrated folders. I'd like to show you some of these figures, if I may. It's of great importance to you and your family too. Ed found himself sitting down, going over the pamphlets. He purchased a $10,000 policy on his own life and then eased the young man out. He looked at the clock. Practically 9:30. Damn. He'd be late to work. He finished fastening his tie, grabbed his coat, turned off the oven and the lights, dumped the dishes in the sink, and ran out on the porch. As he hurried toward the bus stop he was cursing inwardly. Life insurance salesman. Why did the jerk have to come just as he was getting ready to leave? Ed groaned. No telling what the consequences would be, getting to the office late. He wouldn't get there until almost 10. He set himself in anticipation. A sixth sense told him he was in for it. Something bad. It was the wrong day to be late. If only the salesman hadn't come. Ed hopped off the bus a block from his office. He began walking rapidly. The huge clock in front of Stein's jewelry store told him it was almost 10. His heart sank. Old Douglas would give him hell for sure. He could see it now. Douglas puffing and blowing, red-faced, waving his thick finger at him, Miss Evans, smiling behind her typewriter, Jackie, the office boy, grinning and snickering, Earl Hendricks, Joe and Tom, Mary, dark-eyed, full bosom and long lashes. All of them, kidding him the whole rest of the day. He came to the corner and stopped for the light. On the other side of the street rose the big white concrete building, the towering column of steel and cement, girders and glass windows, the office building. Ed flinched. Maybe he could say the elevator got stuck. Somewhere between the second and third floor. The street light changed. Nobody else was crossing. Ed crossed alone. He hopped up on the curb on the far side. And stopped, rigid. The sun had winked off. One moment it was beaming down. Then it was gone. Ed looked sharply up. Gray clouds swirled above him. Huge, formless clouds. Nothing more. An ominous, thick haze that made everything waver and dim. Uneasy chills plucked at him. What was it? He advanced cautiously, feeling his way through the mist. Everything was silent. No sounds, not even the traffic sounds. Ed peered frantically around, trying to see through the rolling haze. No people. No cars. No sun. Nothing. The office building loomed up ahead, ghostly. It was an indistinct gray. He put out his hand uncertainly. A section of the building fell away. It rained down, a torrent of particles. Like sand. Ed gaped foolishly. A cascade of gray debris, spilling around his feet. And where he had touched the building, a jagged cavity yawned, an ugly pit marring the concrete. Dazed, he made his way to the front steps. He mounted them. The steps gave way underfoot. His feet sank down. He was wading through shifting sand, weak, rotted stuff that broke under his weight. He got into the lobby. The lobby was dim and obscure. The overhead lights flickered feebly in the gloom. An unearthly pall hung over everything. He spied the cigar stand. The seller leaned silently, resting on the counter, toothpick between his teeth, his face vacant. And gray. He was gray all over. "Hey," Ed croaked. "What's going on?" The seller did not answer. Ed reached out toward him. His hand touched the seller's gray arm, and passed right through. "Good God," Ed said. The seller's arm came loose. It fell to the lobby floor, disintegrating into fragments. Bits of gray fiber. Like dust. Ed's senses reeled. "Help," he shouted, finding his voice. No answer. He peered around. A few shapes stood here and there, a man reading a newspaper, two women waiting at the elevator. Ed made his way over to the man. He reached out and touched him. The man slowly collapsed. He settled into a heap, a loose pile of gray ash. Dust. Particles. The two women dissolved when he touched them. Silently. They made no sound as they broke apart. Ed found the stairs. He grabbed hold of the banister and climbed. The stairs collapsed under him. He hurried faster. Behind him lay a broken path, his footprints clearly visible in the concrete. Clouds of ash blew around him as he reached the second floor. He gazed down the silent corridor. He saw more clouds of ash. He heard no sound. There was just darkness, rolling darkness. He climbed unsteadily to the third floor. Once, his shoe broke completely through the stair. For a sickening second he hung, poised over a yawning hole that looked down into a bottomless nothing. Then he climbed on, and emerged in front of his own office, Douglas and Blake, Real Estate. The hall was dim, gloomy with clouds of ash. The overhead lights flickered fitfully. He reached for the door handle. The handle came off in his hand. He dropped it and dug his fingernails into the door. The plate glass crashed past him, breaking into bits. He tore the door open and stepped over it, into the office. Miss Evans sat at her typewriter, fingers resting quietly on the keys. She did not move. She was gray, her hair, her skin, her clothing. She was without color. Ed touched her. His fingers went through her shoulder, into dry flakiness. He drew back, sickened. Miss Evans did not stir. He moved on. He pushed against a desk. The desk collapsed into rotting dust. Earl Hendricks stood by the water cooler, a cup in his hand. He was a gray statue, unmoving. Nothing stirred. No sound. No life. The whole office was gray dust, without life or motion. Ed found himself out in the corridor again. He shook his head, dazed. What did it mean? Was he going out of his mind? Was he? A sound. Ed turned, peering into the gray mist. A creature was coming, hurrying rapidly. A man in a white robe. Behind him others came. Men in white, with equipment. They were lugging complex machinery. Hey, Ed gasped weakly. The men stopped. Their mouths opened. Their eyes popped. Look. Something's gone wrong. One still charged. Get the de-energizer. We can't proceed until. The men came toward Ed, moving around him. One lugged a long hose with some sort of nozzle. A portable cart came wheeling up. Instructions were rapidly shouted. Ed broke out of his paralysis. Fear swept over him. Panic. Something hideous was happening. He had to get out. Warn people. Get away. He turned and ran, back down the stairs. The stairs collapsed under him. He fell half a flight, rolling in heaps of dry ash. He got to his feet and hurried on, down to the ground floor. The lobby was lost in the clouds of gray ash. He pushed blindly through, toward the door. Behind him, the white-clad men were coming, dragging their equipment and shouting to each other, hurrying quickly after him. He reached the sidewalk. Behind him the office building wavered and sagged, sinking to one side, torrents of ash raining down in heaps. He raced toward the corner, the men just behind him. Gray clouds swirled around him. He groped his way across the street, hands outstretched. He gained the opposite curb. The sun winked on. Warm yellow sunlight streamed down on him. Cars honked. Traffic lights changed. On all sides men and women in bright spring clothes hurried and pushed, shoppers, a blue-clad cop, salesmen with briefcases. Stores, windows, signs, noisy cars moving up and down the street. And overhead was the bright sun and familiar blue sky. Ed halted, gasping for breath. He turned and looked back the way he had come. Across the street was the office building, as it had always been. Firm and distinct. Concrete and glass and steel. He stepped back a pace and collided with a hurrying citizen. "Hey," the man grunted. "Watch it." "Sorry." Ed shook his head, trying to clear it. From where he stood, the office building looked like always, big and solemn and substantial, rising up imposingly on the other side of the street. But a minute ago. Maybe he was out of his mind. He had seen the building crumbling into dust. Building, and people. They had fallen into grey clouds of dust. And the men in white, they had chased him. Men in white robes, shouting orders, wheeling complex equipment. He was out of his mind. There was no other explanation. Weakly, Ed turned and stumbled along the sidewalk, his mind reeling. He moved blindly, without purpose, lost in a haze of confusion and terror. The clerk was brought into the top-level administrative chambers and told to wait. He paced back and forth nervously, clasping and wringing his hands in an agony of apprehension. He took off his glasses and wiped them shakily. Lord! All the trouble and grief. And it wasn't his fault. But he would have to take the rap. It was his responsibility to get the summoners routed out and their instructions followed. The miserable flea-infested summoner had gone back to sleep, and he would have to answer for it. The doors opened. "All right," a voice murmured, preoccupied. It was a tired, careworn voice. The clerk trembled and entered slowly, sweat dripping down his neck into his celluloid collar. The old man glanced up, laying aside his book. He studied the clerk calmly, his faded blue eyes mild, a deep, ancient mildness that made the clerk tremble even more. He took out his handkerchief and mopped his brow. "I understand there was a mistake," the old man murmured. "In connection with Sector T-137. Something to do with an element from an adjoining area." "That's right." The clerk's voice was faint and husky. "Very unfortunate. What exactly occurred?" "I started out this morning with my instruction sheets. The material relating to T-137 had top priority, of course. I served notice on the summoner in my area that an 8:15 summons was required. Did the summoner understand the urgency?" "Yes, sir." The clerk hesitated. But what?" The clerk twisted miserably. "While my back was turned, the summoner crawled back in his shed and went to sleep. I was occupied, checking the exact time with my watch. I called the moment, but there was no response." "You called at 8:15 exactly?" "Yes, sir. Exactly 8:15. But the summoner was asleep. By the time I managed to arouse him it was 8:16. He summoned, but instead of a friend with a car we got a life insurance salesman." The clerk's face screwed up with disgust. The salesman kept the element there until almost 9:30. Therefore he was late to work instead of early. For a moment the old man was silent. Then the element was not within T-137 when the adjustment began. "No. He arrived about 10 o'clock. During the middle of the adjustment." The old man got to his feet and paced slowly back and forth, face grim, hands behind his back. His long robe flowed out behind him. "A serious matter. During a sector adjustment all related elements from other sectors must be included. Otherwise, their orientations remain out of phase. When this element entered T-137 the adjustment had been in progress 50 minutes. The element encountered the sector at its most de-energized stage. He wandered about until one of the adjustment teams met him. Did they catch him? Unfortunately no. He fled, out of the sector. Into a nearby fully energized area. What then?" The old man stopped pacing, his lined face grim. He ran a heavy hand through his long white hair. "We do not know. We lost contact with him. We will re-establish contact soon, of course. But for the moment he is out of control. What are you going to do? He must be contacted and contained." He must be brought up here. There's no other solution. Up here. It is too late to de-energize him. By the time he is regained he will have told others. To wipe his mind clean would only complicate matters. Usual methods will not suffice. I must deal with this problem myself. I hope he's located quickly, the clerk said. He will be. Every watcher is alerted. Every watcher and every summoner. The old man's eyes twinkled. Even the clerks, although we hesitate to count on them. The clerk flushed. I'll be glad when this thing is over, he muttered. Ruth came tripping down the stairs and out of the building, into the hot noonday sun. She lit a cigarette and hurried along the walk, her small bosom rising and falling as she breathed in the spring air. Ruth. Ed stepped up behind her. Ed. She spun, gasping in astonishment. What are you doing away from? Come on. Ed grabbed her arm, pulling her along. Let's keep moving. But what? I'll tell you later. Ed's face was pale and grim. Let's go where we can talk. In private. I was going down to have lunch at Louie's. We can talk there. Ruth hurried along breathlessly. What is it? What's happened? You look so strange. And why aren't you at work? Did you get fired? They crossed the street and entered a small restaurant. Men and women milled around, getting their lunch. Ed found a table in the back, secluded in a corner. Here. He sat down abruptly. This will do. She slid into the other chair. Ed ordered a cup of coffee. Ruth had salad and creamed tuna on toast, coffee and peach pie. Silently, Ed watched her as she ate, his face dark and moody. Please tell me, Ruth begged. You really want to know? Of course I want to know. Ruth put her small hand anxiously on his. I'm your wife. Something happened today. This morning. I was late to work. A damn insurance man came by and held me up. I was half an hour late. Ruth caught her breath. Douglas fired you. No. Ed ripped a paper napkin slowly into bits. He stuffed the bits in the half-empty water glass. I was worried as hell. I got off the bus and hurried down the street. I noticed it when I stepped up on the curb in front of the office. Noticed what? Ed told her. The whole works. Everything. When he had finished, Ruth sat back, her face white, hands trembling. I see, she murmured. No wonder you're upset. She drank a little cold coffee, the cup rattling against the saucer. What a terrible thing. Ed leaned intently toward his wife. Ruth. Do you think I'm going crazy? Ruth's red lips twisted. I don't know what to say. It's so strange. Yeah. Strange is hardly the word for it. I poked my hands right through them. Like they were clay. Old dry clay. Dust. Dust figures. Ed lit a cigarette from Ruth's pack. When I got out I looked back and there it was. The office building. Like always. You were afraid Mr. Douglas would bawl you out, weren't you? Sure. I was afraid, and guilty. Ed's eyes flickered. I know what you're thinking. I was late and I couldn't face him. So I had some sort of protective psychotic fit. Retreat from reality. He stubbed the cigarette out savagely. Ruth, I've been wandering around town since 2.5 hours. Sure, I'm afraid. I'm afraid like hell to go back. Of Douglas? No. The men in white. Ed shuddered. God. Chasing me. With their damn hoses and equipment. Ruth was silent. Finally she looked up at her husband, her dark eyes bright. You have to go back, Ed. Back? Why? To prove something. Prove what? Prove it's all right. Ruth's hand pressed against his. You have to, Ed. You have to go back and face it. To show yourself there's nothing to be afraid of. The hell with it. After what I saw. Listen, Ruth. I saw the fabric of reality split open. I saw, behind. Underneath. I saw what was really there. And I don't want to go back. I don't want to see dust people again. Ever. Ruth's eyes were fixed intently on him. I'll go back with you, she said. For God's sake. For your sake. For your sanity. So you'll know. Ruth got abruptly to her feet, pulling her coat around her. Come on, Ed. I'll go with you. We'll go up there together. To the office of Douglas and Blake, Real Estate. I'll even go in with you to see Mr. Douglas. Ed got up slowly, staring hard at his wife. You think I blacked out? Cold feet. Couldn't face the boss. His voice was low and strained. Don't you? Ruth was already threading her way toward the cashier. Come on. You'll see. It'll all be there. Just like it always was. Okay, Ed said. He followed her slowly. We'll go back there, and see which of us is right. They crossed the street together, Ruth holding on tight to Ed's arm. Ahead of them was the building, the towering structure of concrete and metal and glass. There it is, Ruth said. See? There it was, all right. The big building rose up, firm and solid, glittering in the early afternoon sun, its windows sparkling brightly. Ed and Ruth stepped up onto the curb. Ed tensed himself, his body rigid. He winced as his foot touched the pavement. But nothing happened, the street noises continued, cars, people hurrying past, a kid selling papers. There were sounds, smells, the noises of the city in the middle of the day. And overhead was the sun and the bright blue sky. See? Ruth said. I was right. They walked up the front steps, into the lobby. Behind the cigar stand the seller stood, arms folded, listening to the ball game. Hi, Mr. Fletcher, he called to Ed. His face lit up good-naturedly. Who's the dame? Your wife know about this? Ed laughed unsteadily. They passed on toward the elevator. 4 or 5 businessmen stood waiting. They were middle-aged men, well-dressed, waiting impatiently in a bunch. Hey, Fletcher, one said. Where you been all day? Douglas is yelling his head off. Hello, Earl, Ed muttered. He gripped Ruth's arm. Been a little sick. The elevator came. They got in. The elevator rose. Hi, Ed, the elevator operator said. Who's the good-looking gal? Why don't you introduce her around? Ed grinned mechanically. My wife. The elevator let them off at the 3rd floor. Ed and Ruth got out, heading toward the glass door of Douglas and Blake, Real Estate. Ed halted, breathing shallowly. Wait. He licked his lips. Ruth waited calmly as Ed wiped his forehead and neck with his handkerchief. All right now? Yeah. Ed moved forward. He pulled open the glass door. Miss Evans glanced up, ceasing her typing. Ed Fletcher. Where on earth have you been? I've been sick. Hello, Tom. Tom glanced up from his work. Hi, Ed. Say, Douglas is yelling for your scalp. Where have you been? I know. Ed turned wearily to Ruth. I guess I better go in and face the music. Ruth squeezed his arm. You'll be all right. I know. She smiled, a relieved flash of white teeth and red lips. Okay. Call me if you need me. Sure. Ed kissed her briefly on the mouth. Thanks, honey. Thanks a lot. I don't know what the hell went wrong with me. I guess it's over. Forget it. So long. Ruth skipped back out of the office, the door closing after her. Ed listened to her race down the hall to the elevator. Nice little gal, Jackie said appreciatively. Yeah. Ed nodded, straightening his necktie. He moved unhappily toward the inner office, steeling himself. Well, he had to face it. Ruth was right. But he was going to have a hell of a time explaining it to the boss. He could see Douglas now, thick red wattles, big bull roar, face distorted with rage. Ed stopped abruptly at the entrance to the inner office. He froze rigid. The inner office, it was changed. The hackles of his neck rose. Cold fear gripped him, clutching at his windpipe. The inner office was different. He turned his head slowly, taking in the sight, the desks, chairs, fixtures, file cabinets, pictures. Changes. Little changes. Subtle. Ed closed his eyes and opened them slowly. He was alert, breathing rapidly, his pulse racing. It was changed, all right. No doubt about it. What's the matter, Ed? Tom asked. The staff watched him curiously, pausing in their work. Ed said nothing. He advanced slowly into the inner office. The office had been gone over. He could tell. Things had been altered. Rearranged. Nothing obvious, nothing he could put his finger on. But he could tell. Joe Kent greeted him uneasily. What's the matter, Ed? You look like a wild dog. Is something? Ed studied Joe. He was different. Not the same. What was it? Joe's face. It was a little fuller. His shirt was blue-striped. Joe never wore blue stripes. Ed examined Joe's desk. He saw papers and accounts. The desk, it was too far to the right. And it was bigger. It wasn't the same desk. The picture on the wall. It wasn't the same. It was a different picture entirely. And the things on top of the file cabinet, some were new, others were gone. He looked back through the door. Now that he thought about it, Miss Evans' hair was different, done a different way. And it was lighter. In here, Mary, filing her nails, over by the window, she was taller, fuller. Her purse, lying on the desk in front of her, a red purse, red knit. You always have that purse? Ed demanded. Mary glanced up. What? That purse. You always have that? Mary laughed. She smoothed her skirt coyly around her shapely thighs, her long lashes blinking modestly. Why, Mr. Fletcher? What do you mean? Ed turned away. He knew. Even if she didn't. She had been redone, changed, her purse, her clothes, her figure, everything about her. None of them knew, but him. His mind spun dizzily. They were all changed. All of them were different. They had all been remolded, recast. Subtly, but it was there. The wastebasket. It was smaller, not the same. The window shades, white, not ivory. The wallpaper was not the same pattern. The lighting fixtures. Endless, subtle changes. Ed made his way back to the inner office. He lifted his hand and knocked on Douglas' door. Come in. Ed pushed the door open. Nathan Douglas looked up impatiently. Mr. Douglas, Ed began. He came into the room unsteadily, and stopped. Douglas was not the same. Not at all. His whole office was changed, the rugs, the drapes. The desk was oak, not mahogany. And Douglas himself. Douglas was younger, thinner. His hair, brown. His skin not so red. His face smoother. No wrinkles. Chin reshaped. Eyes green, not black. He was a different man. But still Douglas, a different Douglas. A different version. What is it? Douglas demanded impatiently. Oh, it's you, Fletcher. Where were you this morning? Ed backed out. Fast. He slammed the door and hurried back through the inner office. Tom and Miss Evans glanced up, startled. Ed passed by them, grabbing the hall door open. Hey! Tom called. What? Ed hurried down the hall. Terror leaped through him. He had to hurry. He had seen. There wasn't much time. He came to the elevator and stabbed the button. No time. He ran to the stairs and started down. He reached the second floor. His terror grew. It was a matter of seconds. Seconds. The public phone. Ed ran into the phone booth. He dragged the door shut after him. Wildly, he dropped a dime in the slot and dialed. He had to call the police. He held the receiver to his ear, his heart pounding. Warn them. Changes. Somebody tampering with reality. Altering it. He had been right. The white-clad men, their equipment, going through the building. Hello. Ed shouted hoarsely. There was no answer. No hum. Nothing. Ed peered frantically out the door. And he sagged, defeated. Slowly, he hung up the telephone receiver. He was no longer on the second floor. The phone booth was rising, leaving the second floor behind, carrying him up, faster and faster. It rose floor by floor, moving silently, swiftly. The phone booth passed through the ceiling of the building and out into the bright sunlight. It gained speed. The ground fell away below. Buildings and streets were getting smaller each moment. Tiny specks hurried along, far below, cars and people, dwindling rapidly. Clouds drifted between him and the earth. Ed shut his eyes, dizzy with fright. He held on desperately to the door handles of the phone booth. Faster and faster the phone booth climbed. The earth was rapidly being left behind, far below. Ed peered up wildly. Where? Where was he going? Where was it taking him? He stood gripping the door handles, waiting. The clerk nodded curtly. That's him, all right. The element in question. Ed Fletcher looked around him. He was in a huge chamber. The edges fell away into indistinct shadows. In front of him stood a man with notes and ledgers under his arm, peering at him through steel-rimmed glasses. He was a nervous little man, sharp-eyed, with celluloid collar, blue serge suit, vest, watch chain. He wore black shiny shoes. And beyond him, an old man sat quietly, in an immense modern chair. He watched Fletcher calmly, his blue eyes mild and tired. A strange thrill shot through Fletcher. It was not fear. Rather it was a vibration, rattling his bones, a deep sense of awe, tinged with fascination. What is this place? He asked faintly. He was still dazed from his quick ascent. Don't ask questions. The nervous little man snapped angrily, tapping his pencil against his ledgers. You're here to answer, not ask. The old man moved a little. He raised his hand. I will speak to the element alone, he murmured. His voice was low. It vibrated and rumbled through the chamber. Again the wave of fascinated awe swept Ed. Alone. The little fellow backed away, gathering his books and papers in his arms. Of course. He glanced hostilely at Ed Fletcher. I'm glad he's finally in custody. All the work and trouble just for. He disappeared through a door. The door closed softly behind him. Ed and the old man were alone. Please sit down, the old man said. Ed found a seat. He sat down awkwardly, nervously. He got out his cigarettes and then put them away again. What's wrong? The old man asked. I'm just beginning to understand. Understand what? That I'm dead. The old man smiled briefly. Dead? No, you're not dead. You're visiting. An unusual event, but necessitated by circumstances. He leaned toward Ed. Mr. Fletcher, you have got yourself involved in something. Yeah, Ed agreed. I wish I knew what it was. Or how it happened. It was not your fault. You're the victim of a clerical error. A mistake was made, not by you. But involving you. What mistake? Ed rubbed his forehead wearily. I got in on something. I saw through. I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. The old man nodded. That's right. You saw something you were not supposed to see, something few elements have been aware of, let alone witnessed. Elements? An official term. Let it pass. A mistake was made, but we hope to rectify it. It is my hope that. Those people, Ed interrupted. Heaps of dry ash. And gray. Like they were dead. Only it was everything, the stairs and walls and floor. No color or life. That sector had been temporarily de-energized. So the adjustment team could enter and effect changes. Changes. Ed nodded. That's right. When I went back later, everything was alive again. But not the same. It was all different. The adjustment was complete by noon. The team finished its work and re-energized the sector. I see, Ed muttered. You were supposed to have been in the sector when the adjustment began. Because of an error you were not. You came into the sector late, during the adjustment itself. You fled, and when you returned it was over. You saw, and you should not have seen. Instead of a witness you should have been part of the adjustment. Like the others, you should have undergone changes. Sweat came out on Ed Fletcher's head. He wiped it away. His stomach turned over. Weakly, he cleared his throat. I get the picture. His voice was almost inaudible. A chilling premonition moved through him. I was supposed to be changed like the others. But I guess something went wrong. Something went wrong. An error occurred. And now a serious problem exists. You have seen these things. You know a great deal. And you are not coordinated with the new configuration. Gosh, Ed muttered. Well, I won't tell anybody. Cold sweat poured off him. You can count on that. I'm as good as changed. You have already told someone, the old man said coldly. Me? Ed blinked. Who? Your wife. Ed trembled. The color drained from his face, leaving it sickly white. That's right. I did. Your wife knows. The old man's face twisted angrily. A woman. Of all the things to tell. I didn't know. Ed retreated, panic leaping through him. But I know now. You can count on me. Consider me changed. The ancient blue eyes bored keenly into him, peering far into his depths. And you were going to call the police. You wanted to inform the authorities. But I didn't know who was doing the changing. Now you know. The natural process must be supplemented, adjusted here and there. Corrections must be made. We are fully licensed to make such corrections. Our adjustment teams perform vital work. Ed plucked up a measure of courage. This particular adjustment. Douglas. The office. What was it for? I'm sure it was some worthwhile purpose. The old man waved his hand. Behind him in the shadows an immense map glowed into existence. Ed caught his breath. The edges of the map faded off in obscurity. He saw an infinite web of detailed sections, a network of squares and ruled lines. Each square was marked. Some glowed with a blue light. The lights altered constantly. The sector board, the old man said. He sighed wearily. A staggering job. Sometimes we wonder how we can go on another period. But it must be done. For the good of all. For your good. The change. In our sector. Your office deals in real estate. The old Douglas was a shrewd man, but rapidly becoming infirm. His physical health was waning. In a few days Douglas will be offered a chance to purchase a large unimproved forest area in Western Canada. It will require most of his assets. The older, less virile Douglas would have hesitated. It is imperative he not hesitate. He must purchase the area and clear the land at once. Only a younger man, a younger Douglas, would undertake this. When the land is cleared, certain anthropological remains will be discovered. They have already been placed there. Douglas will lease his land to the Canadian government for scientific study. The remains found there will cause international excitement in learned circles. A chain of events will be set in motion. Men from numerous countries will come to Canada to examine the remains. Soviet, Polish, and Czech scientists will make the journey. The chain of events will draw these scientists together for the first time in years. National research will be temporarily forgotten in the excitement of these non-national discoveries. One of the leading Soviet scientists will make friends with a Belgian scientist. Before they depart they will agree to correspond, without the knowledge of their governments, of course. The circle will widen. Other scientists on both sides will be drawn in. A society will be founded. More and more educated men will transfer an increasing amount of time to this international society. Purely national research will suffer a slight but extremely critical eclipse. The war tension will somewhat wane. This alteration is vital. And it is dependent on the purchase and clearing of the section of wilderness in Canada. The old Douglas would not have dared take the risk. But the altered Douglas, and his altered, more youthful staff, will pursue this work with wholehearted enthusiasm. And from this, the vital chain of widening events will come about. The beneficiaries will be you. Our methods may seem strange and indirect. Even incomprehensible. But I assure you we know what we're doing. I know that now, Ed said. So you do. You know a great deal. Much too much. No element should possess such knowledge. I should perhaps call an adjustment team in here. A picture formed in Ed's mind, swirling gray clouds, gray men and women. He shuddered. Look, he croaked. I'll do anything. Anything at all. Only don't de-energize me. Sweat ran down his face. Okay. The old man pondered. Perhaps some alternative could be found. There is another possibility. What? Ed asked eagerly. What is it? The old man spoke slowly, thoughtfully. If I allow you to return, you will swear never to speak of the matter. Will you swear not to reveal to anyone the things you saw? The things you know? Sure. Ed gasped eagerly, blinding relief flooding over him. I swear. Your wife. She must know nothing more. She must think it was only a passing psychological fit, retreat from reality. She thinks that already. She must continue to. Ed set his jaw firmly. I'll see that she continues to think it was a mental aberration. She'll never know what really happened. You are certain you can keep the truth from her? Sure, Ed said confidently. I know I can. All right. The old man nodded slowly. I will send you back. But you must tell no one. He swelled visibly. Remember, you will eventually come back to me, everyone does, in the end, and your fate will not be enviable. I won't tell her, Ed said, sweating. I promise. You have my word on that. I can handle Ruth. Don't give it a second thought. Ed arrived home at sunset. He blinked, dazed from the rapid descent. For a moment he stood on the pavement, regaining his balance and catching his breath. Then he walked quickly up the path. He pushed the door open and entered the little green stucco house. Ed. Ruth came flying, face distorted with tears. She threw her arms around him, hugging him tight. "Where the hell have you been?" "Been?" Ed murmured. "At the office, of course." Ruth pulled back abruptly. "No, you haven't." Vague tendrils of alarm plucked at Ed. "Of course I have. Where else?" "I called Douglas about 3. He said you left. You walked out, practically as soon as I turned my back." "Eddie." Ed patted her nervously. "Take it easy, honey." He began unbuttoning his coat. "Everything's okay. Understand? Things are perfectly all right." Ruth sat down on the arm of the couch. She blew her nose, dabbing at her eyes. "If you knew how much I've worried." She put her handkerchief away and folded her arms. "I want to know where you were." Uneasily, Ed hung his coat in the closet. He came over and kissed her. Her lips were ice cold. "I'll tell you all about it. But what do you say we have something to eat? I'm starved." Ruth studied him intently. She got down from the arm of the couch. "I'll change and fix dinner." She hurried into the bedroom and slipped off her shoes and nylons. Ed followed her. "I didn't mean to worry you," he said carefully. "After you left me today I realized you were right." "Oh." Ruth unfastened her blouse and skirt, arranging them over a hanger. "Right about what?" "About me." He manufactured a grin and made it glow across his face. "About what happened?" Ruth hung her slip over the hanger. She studied her husband intently as she struggled into her tight-fitting jeans. "Go on." The moment had come. It was now or never. Ed Fletcher braced himself and chose his words carefully. "I realized," he stated, "that the whole darn thing was in my mind." "You were right, Ruth. Completely right. And I even realize what caused it." Ruth rolled her cotton t-shirt down and tucked it in her jeans. "What was the cause?" "Overwork." "Overwork?" "I need a vacation. I haven't had a vacation in years. My mind isn't on my job. I've been daydreaming." He said it firmly, but his heart was in his mouth. "I need to get away. To the mountains. Bass fishing. Or," he searched his mind frantically. "Or." Ruth came toward him ominously. "Ed," she said sharply. "Look at me. What's the matter?" Panic shot through him. "Why are you looking at me like that? Where were you this afternoon?" Ed's grin faded. "I told you. I went for a walk. Didn't I tell you? A walk. To think things over. Don't lie to me, Eddie Fletcher. I can tell when you're lying." Fresh tears welled up in Ruth's eyes. Her breasts rose and fell excitedly under her cotton shirt. "Admit it. You didn't go for a walk." Ed stammered weakly. Sweat poured off him. He sagged helplessly against the door. "What do you mean?" Ruth's black eyes flashed with anger. "Come on. I want to know where you were. Tell me. I have a right to know. What really happened?" Ed retreated in terror, his resolve melting like wax. "It was going all wrong. Honest. I went out for a..." "Tell me." Ruth's sharp fingernails dug into his arm. "I want to know where you were, and who you were with." Ed opened his mouth. He tried to grin, but his face failed to respond. "I don't know what you mean." "You know what I mean. Who were you with? Where did you go? Tell me. I'll find out, sooner or later." There was no way out. He was licked, and he knew it. He couldn't keep it from her. Desperately he stalled, praying for time. If he could only distract her, get her mind on something else. If she would only let up, even for a second. He could invent something, a better story. Time, he needed more time. Ruth, you've got to. Suddenly there was a sound, the bark of a dog echoing through the dark house. Ruth let go, cocking her head alertly. That was Dobby. I think somebody's coming. The doorbell rang. You stay here. I'll be right back. Ruth ran out of the room, to the front door. Darn it. She pulled the front door open. Good evening. The young man stepped quickly inside, loaded down with objects, grinning broadly at Ruth. I'm from the Sweeprite Vacuum Cleaner Company. Ruth scowled impatiently. Really, we're about to sit down at the table. Oh, this will only take a moment. The young man set down the vacuum cleaner and its attachments with a metallic crash. Rapidly, he unrolled a long illustrated banner, showing the vacuum cleaner in action. Now, if you'll just hold this while I plug in the cleaner. He bustled happily about, unplugging the TV set, plugging in the cleaner, pushing the chairs out of his way. I'll show you the drape scraper first. He attached a hose and nozzle to the big gleaming tank. Now, if you'll just sit down, I'll demonstrate each of these easy-to-use attachments. His happy voice rose over the roar of the cleaner. You'll notice. Ed Fletcher sat down on the bed. He groped in his pocket until he found his cigarettes. Shakily he lit one and leaned back against the wall, weak with relief. He gazed up, a look of gratitude on his face. Thanks, he said softly. I think we'll make it, after all. Thanks a lot. Beyond the door. That night at the dinner table he brought it out and set it down beside her plate. Doris stared at it, her hand to her mouth. My God, what is it? She looked up at him, bright-eyed. Well, open it. Doris tore the ribbon and paper from the square package with her sharp nails, her bosom rising and falling. Larry stood watching her as she lifted the lid. He lit a cigarette and leaned against the wall. A cuckoo clock. Doris cried. A real old cuckoo clock like my mother had. She turned the clock over and over. Just like my mother had, when Pete was still alive. Her eyes sparkled with tears. It's made in Germany, Larry said. After a moment he added, Carl got it for me wholesale. He knows some guy in the clock business. Otherwise I wouldn't have. He stopped. Doris made a funny little sound. I mean, otherwise I wouldn't have been able to afford it. He scowled. What's the matter with you? You've got your clock, haven't you? Isn't that what you want? Doris sat holding on to the clock, her fingers pressed against the brown wood. Well, Larry said, what's the matter? He watched in amazement as she leaped up and ran from the room, still clutching the clock. He shook his head. Never satisfied. They're all that way. Never get enough. He sat down at the table and finished his meal. The cuckoo clock was not very large. It was handmade, however, and there were countless frets on it, little indentations and ornaments scored in the soft wood. Doris sat on the bed drying her eyes and winding the clock. She set the hands by her wristwatch. Presently she carefully moved the hands to 2 minutes of 10. She carried the clock over to the dresser and propped it up. Then she sat waiting, her hands twisted together in her lap, waiting for the cuckoo to come out, for the hour to strike. As she sat she thought about Larry and what he had said. And what she had said, too, for that matter, not that she could be blamed for any of it. After all, she couldn't keep listening to him forever without defending herself, you had to blow your own trumpet in the world. She touched her handkerchief to her eyes suddenly. Why did he have to say that, about getting it wholesale? Why did he have to spoil it all? If he felt that way he needn't have got it in the first place. She clenched her fists. He was so mean, so damn mean. But she was glad of the little clock sitting there ticking to itself, with its funny grilled edges and the door. Inside the door was the cuckoo, waiting to come out. Was he listening, his head cocked on one side, listening to hear the clock strike so that he would know to come out? Did he sleep between hours? Well, she would soon see him, she could ask him. And she would show the clock to Bob. He would love it. Bob loved old things, even old stamps and buttons. He liked to go with her to the stores. Of course, it was a little awkward, but Larry had been staying at the office so much, and that helped. If only Larry didn't call up sometimes too. There was a whir. The clock shuddered and all at once the door opened. The cuckoo came out, sliding swiftly. He paused and looked around solemnly, scrutinizing her, the room, the furniture. It was the first time he had seen her, she realized, smiling to herself in pleasure. She stood up, coming toward him shyly. "Go on," she said. "I'm waiting." The cuckoo opened his bill. He whirred and chirped, quickly, rhythmically. Then, after a moment of contemplation, he retired. And the door snapped shut. She was delighted. She clapped her hands and spun in a little circle. He was marvelous, perfect. And the way he had looked around, studying her, sizing her up. He liked her, she was certain of it. And she, of course, loved him at once, completely. He was just what she had hoped would come out of the little door. Doris went to the clock. She bent over the little door, her lips close to the wood. "Do you hear me?" she whispered. "I think you're the most wonderful cuckoo in the world." She paused, embarrassed. "I hope you'll like it here." Then she went downstairs again, slowly, her head high. Larry and the cuckoo clock really never got along well from the start. Doris said it was because he didn't wind it right, and it didn't like being only half-wound all the time. Larry turned the job of winding over to her. The cuckoo came out every quarter hour and ran the spring down without remorse, and someone had to be ever after it, winding it up again. Doris did her best, but she forgot a good deal of the time. Then Larry would throw his newspaper down with an elaborate weary motion and stand up. He would go into the dining room where the clock was mounted on the wall over the fireplace. He would take the clock down and making sure that he had his thumb over the little door, he would wind it up. "Why do you put your thumb over the door?" Doris asked once. "You're supposed to." She raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure? I wonder if it isn't that you don't want him to come out while you're standing so close." "Why not? Maybe you're afraid of him." Larry laughed. He put the clock back on the wall and gingerly removed his thumb. When Doris wasn't looking he examined his thumb. There was still a trace of the nick cut out of the soft part of it. Who, or what, had pecked at him? One Saturday morning, when Larry was down at the office working over some important special accounts, Bob Chambers came to the front porch and rang the bell. Doris was taking a quick shower. She dried herself and slipped into her robe. When she opened the door Bob stepped inside, grinning. "Hi," he said, looking around. "It's all right. Larry's at the office." "Fine." Bob gazed at her slim legs below the hem of the robe. "How nice you look today." She laughed. "Be careful. Maybe I shouldn't let you in after all." They looked at one another, half amused, half frightened. Presently Bob said, "If you want, I'll." "No, for God's sake." She caught hold of his sleeve. "Just get out of the doorway so I can close it. Mrs. Peters across the street, you know." She closed the door. "And I want to show you something," she said. "You haven't seen it." He was interested. "An antique? Or what?" She took his arm, leading him toward the dining room. "You'll love it, Bobby." She stopped, wide-eyed. "I hope you will. You must love it. It means so much to me, he means so much." "He?" Bob frowned. "Who is he?" Doris laughed. "You're jealous. Come on. A moment later they stood before the clock, looking up at it. "He'll come out in a few minutes. Wait until you see him. I know you two will get along just fine. What does Larry think of him?" "They don't like each other. Sometimes when Larry's here he won't come out. Larry gets mad if he doesn't come out on time. He says." "Says what?" Doris looked down. "He always says he's been robbed, even if he did get it wholesale." She brightened. "But I know he won't come out because he doesn't like Larry. When I'm here alone he comes right out for me, every 15 minutes, even though he really only has to come out on the hour." She gazed up at the clock. "He comes out for me because he wants to. We talk, I tell him things. Of course, I'd like to have him upstairs in my room, but it wouldn't be right." There was the sound of footsteps on the front porch. They looked at each other, horrified. Larry pushed the front door open, grunting. He set his briefcase down and took off his hat. Then he saw Bob for the first time. "Chambers. I'll be damned." His eyes narrowed. "What are you doing here?" He came into the dining room. Doris drew her robe about her helplessly, backing away. Bob began. "That is, he broke off, glancing at Doris. Suddenly the clock began to whir. The cuckoo came rushing out, bursting into sound. Larry moved toward him. "Shut that din off," he said. He raised his fist toward the clock. The cuckoo snapped into silence and retreated. The door closed. "That's better." Larry studied Doris and Bob, standing mutely together. "I came over to look at the clock," Bob said. "Doris told me that it's a rare antique and that. Nuts. I bought it myself." Larry walked up to him. "Get out of here." He turned to Doris. "You too. And take that damn clock with you." He paused, rubbing his chin. "No. Leave the clock here. It's mine, I bought it and paid for it." In the weeks that followed after Doris left, Larry and the cuckoo clock got along even worse than before. For one thing, the cuckoo stayed inside most of the time, sometimes even at 12 o'clock when he should have been busiest. And if he did come out at all he usually spoke only once or twice, never the correct number of times. And there was a sullen, uncooperative note in his voice, a jarring sound that made Larry uneasy and a little angry. But he kept the clock wound, because the house was very still and quiet and it got on his nerves not to hear someone running around, talking and dropping things. And even the whirring of a clock sounded good to him. But he didn't like the cuckoo at all. And sometimes he spoke to him. "Listen," he said late one night to the closed little door. "I know you can hear me. I ought to give you back to the Germans, back to the Black Forest." He paced back and forth. "I wonder what they're doing now, the two of them. That young punk with his books and his antiques. A man shouldn't be interested in antiques, that's for women." He set his jaw. "Isn't that right?" The clock said nothing. Larry walked up in front of it. "Isn't that right?" he demanded. "Don't you have anything to say?" He looked at the face of the clock. It was almost 11, just a few seconds before the hour. "All right. I'll wait until 11. Then I want to hear what you have to say. You've been pretty quiet the last few weeks since she left." He grinned wryly. "Maybe you don't like it here since she's gone." He scowled. "Well, I paid for you, and you're coming out whether you like it or not. You hear me?" 11 o'clock came. Far off, at the end of town, the great tower clock boomed sleepily to itself. But the little door remained shut. Nothing moved. The minute hand passed on and the cuckoo did not stir. He was someplace inside the clock, beyond the door, silent and remote. "All right, if that's the way you feel," Larry murmured, his lips twisting. "But it isn't fair. It's your job to come out. We all have to do things we don't like." He went unhappily into the kitchen and opened the great gleaming refrigerator. As he poured himself a drink he thought about the clock. There was no doubt about it, the cuckoo should come out, Doris or no Doris. He had always liked her, from the very start. They had got along well, the two of them. Probably he liked Bob too, probably he had seen enough of Bob to get to know him. They would be quite happy together, Bob and Doris and the cuckoo. Larry finished his drink. He opened the drawer at the sink and took out the hammer. He carried it carefully into the dining room. The clock was ticking gently to itself on the wall. "Look," he said, waving the hammer. "You know what I have here? You know what I'm going to do with it? I'm going to start on you, first." He smiled. "Birds of a feather, that's what you are, the three of you." The room was silent. "Are you coming out? Or do I have to come in and get you?" The clock whirred a little. "I hear you in there. You've got a lot of talking to do, enough for the last 3 weeks. As I figure it, you owe me." The door opened. The cuckoo came out fast, straight at him. Larry was looking down, his brow wrinkled in thought. He glanced up, and the cuckoo caught him squarely in the eye. Down he went, hammer and chair and everything, hitting the floor with a tremendous crash. For a moment the cuckoo paused, its small body poised rigidly. Then it went back inside its house. The door snapped tight shut after it. The man lay on the floor, stretched out grotesquely, his head bent over to one side. Nothing moved or stirred. The room was completely silent, except, of course, for the ticking of the clock. "I see," Doris said, her face tight. Bob put his arm around her, steadying her. "Doctor," Bob said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," the doctor said. "Is it very easy to break your neck, falling from so low a chair?" "It wasn't very far to fall. I wonder if it might not have been an accident. Is there any chance it might have been suicide?" The doctor rubbed his jaw. "I never heard of anyone committing suicide that way. It was an accident, I'm positive." "I don't mean suicide," Bob murmured under his breath, looking up at the clock on the wall. "I meant something else." But no one heard him. The Crystal Crypt. "Attention, inner flight ship. Attention. You are ordered to land at the control station on Deimos for inspection. Attention. You are to land at once." The metallic rasp of the speaker echoed through the corridors of the great ship. The passengers glanced at each other uneasily, murmuring and peering out the port windows at the small speck below, the dot of rock that was the Martian checkpoint, Deimos. "What's up?" an anxious passenger asked one of the pilots, hurrying through the ship to check the escape lock. "We have to land. Keep seated." The pilot went on. "Land? But why?" They all looked at each other. Hovering above the bulging inner flight ship were 3 slender Martian pursuit craft, poised and alert for any emergency. As the inner flight ship prepared to land, the pursuit ships dropped lower, carefully maintaining themselves a short distance away. "There's something going on," a woman passenger said nervously. "Lord, I thought we were finally through with those Martians. Now what?" "I don't blame them for giving us one last going over," a heavy-set business man said to his companion. "After all, we're the last ship leaving Mars for Terra. We're damn lucky they let us go at all. You think there really will be war?" A young man said to the girl sitting in the seat next to him. "Those Martians won't dare fight, not with our weapons and ability to produce. We could take care of Mars in a month. It's all talk." The girl glanced at him. "Don't be so sure. Mars is desperate. They'll fight tooth and nail. I've been on Mars 3 years." She shuddered. "Thank goodness I'm getting away. If." "Prepare to land," the pilot's voice came. The ship began to settle slowly, dropping down toward the tiny emergency field on the seldom visited moon. Down the ship dropped. There was a grinding sound, a sickening jolt. Then silence. "We've landed," the heavy-set businessman said. "They better not do anything to us. Terra will rip them apart if they violate one space article. Please keep your seats," the pilot's voice came. "No one is to leave the ship, according to the Martian authorities. We are to remain here." A restless stir filled the ship. Some of the passengers began to read uneasily, others stared out at the deserted field, nervous and on edge, watching the 3 Martian pursuit ships land and disgorge groups of armed men. The Martian soldiers were crossing the field quickly, moving toward them, running double time. This inter-flight spaceship was the last passenger vessel to leave Mars for Terra. All other ships had long since left, returning to safety before the outbreak of hostilities. The passengers were the very last to go, the final group of Terrans to leave the grim red planet, businessmen, expatriates, tourists, any and all Terrans who had not already gone home. "What do you suppose they want?" the young man said to the girl. "It's hard to figure Martians out, isn't it? First they give the ship clearance, let us take off, and now they radio us to set down again. By the way, my name's Thatcher, Bob Thatcher. Since we're going to be here a while." The port lock opened. Talking ceased abruptly, as everyone turned. A black-clad Martian official, a province leader, stood framed against the bleak sunlight, staring around the ship. Behind him a handful of Martian soldiers stood waiting, their guns ready. "This will not take long," the leader said, stepping into the ship, the soldiers following him. "You will be allowed to continue your trip shortly." An audible sigh of relief went through the passengers. "Look at him," the girl whispered to Thatcher. "How I hate those black uniforms." "He's just a provincial leader," Thatcher said. "Don't worry." The leader stood for a moment, his hands on his hips, looking around at them without expression. "I have ordered your ship grounded so that an inspection can be made of all persons aboard," he said. "You Terrans are the last to leave our planet. Most of you are ordinary and harmless. I am not interested in you. I am interested in finding 3 saboteurs, 3 Terrans, 2 men and a woman, who have committed an incredible act of destruction and violence. They are said to have fled to this ship." Murmurs of surprise and indignation broke out on all sides. The leader motioned the soldiers to follow him up the aisle. 2 hours ago a Martian city was destroyed. Nothing remains, only a depression in the sand where the city was. The city and all its people have completely vanished. An entire city destroyed in a second. Mars will never rest until the saboteurs are captured. And we know they are aboard this ship. "It's impossible," the heavy-set businessman said. "There aren't any saboteurs here." "We'll begin with you," the leader said to him, stepping up beside the man's seat. One of the soldiers passed the leader a square metal box. "This will soon tell us if you're speaking the truth. Stand up. Get on your feet." The man rose slowly, flushing. "See here. Are you involved in the destruction of the city? Answer." The man swallowed angrily. "I know nothing about any destruction of any city. And furthermore." "He is telling the truth," the metal box said tonelessly. "Next person." The leader moved down the aisle. A thin, bald-headed man stood up nervously. "No, sir," he said. "I don't know a thing about it." "He is telling the truth," the box affirmed. "Next person." "Stand up." One person after another stood, answered, and sat down again in relief. At last there were only a few people left who had not been questioned. The leader paused, studying them intently. "Only 5 left. The 3 must be among you. We have narrowed it down." His hand moved to his belt. Something flashed, a rod of pale fire. He raised the rod, pointing it steadily at the 5 people. "All right, the first one of you. What do you know about this destruction? Are you involved with the destruction of our city?" "No, not at all," the man murmured. Yes, he's telling the truth, the box intoned. Next. Nothing, I know nothing. I had nothing to do with it. True, the box said. The ship was silent. 3 people remained, a middle-aged man and his wife and their son, a boy of about 12. They stood in a corner, staring white-faced at the lighter, at the rod in his dark fingers. It must be you, the lighter grated, moving toward them. The Martian soldiers raised their guns. It must be you. You there, the boy. What do you know about the destruction of our city? Answer. The boy shook his head. Nothing, he whispered. The box was silent for a moment. He is telling the truth, it said reluctantly. Next. Nothing, the woman muttered. Nothing. The truth. Next. I had nothing to do with blowing up your city, the man said. You're wasting your time. It is the truth, the box said. For a long time the lighter stood, toying with his rod. At last he pushed it back in his belt and signaled the soldiers toward the exit lock. You may proceed on your trip, he said. He walked after the soldiers. At the hatch he stopped, looking back at the passengers, his face grim. You may go, but Mars will not allow her enemies to escape. The 3 saboteurs will be caught, I promise you. He rubbed his dark jaw thoughtfully. It is strange. I was certain they were on this ship. Again he looked coldly around at the Terrans. Perhaps I was wrong. All right, proceed. But remember, the 3 will be caught, even if it takes endless years. Mars will catch them and punish them. I swear it. For a long time no one spoke. The ship lumbered through space again, its jets firing evenly, calmly, moving the passengers toward their own planet, toward home. Behind them Deimos and the red ball that was Mars dropped farther and farther away each moment, disappearing and fading into the distance. A sigh of relief passed through the passengers. What a lot of hot air that was, one grumbled. Barbarians, a woman said. A few of them stood up, moving out into the aisle, toward the lounge and the cocktail bar. Beside Thatcher the girl got to her feet, pulling her jacket around her shoulders. Pardon me, she said, stepping past him. Going to the bar? Thatcher said. Mind if I come along? I suppose not. They followed the others into the lounge, walking together up the aisle. You know, Thatcher said, I don't even know your name, yet. My name is Mara Gordon. Mara? That's a nice name. What part of Terra are you from? North America. New York. I've been in New York, Mara said. New York is very lovely. She was slender and pretty, with a cloud of dark hair tumbling down her neck, against her leather jacket. They entered the lounge and stood undecided. Let's sit at a table, Mara said, looking around at the people at the bar, mostly men. Perhaps that table over there. But someone's there already, Thatcher said. The heavy-set businessman had sat down at the table and deposited his sample case on the floor. Do we want to sit with him? Oh, it's all right, Mara said, crossing to the table. May we sit here, she said to the man. The man looked up, half rising. It's a pleasure, he murmured. He studied Thatcher intently. However, a friend of mine will be joining me in a moment. I'm sure there's room enough for us all, Mara said. She seated herself and Thatcher helped her with her chair. He sat down, too, glancing up suddenly at Mara and the businessman. They were looking at each other almost as if something had passed between them. The man was middle-aged, with a florid face and tired, gray eyes. His hands were mottled with the veins showing thickly. At the moment he was tapping nervously. My name's Thatcher, Thatcher said to him, holding out his hand. Bob Thatcher. Since we're going to be together for a while we might as well get to know each other. The man studied him. Slowly his hand came out. Why not? My name's Erickson. Ralph Erickson. Erickson. Thatcher smiled. You look like a commercial man, to me. He nodded toward the sample case on the floor. Am I right? The man named Erickson started to answer, but at that moment there was a stir. A thin man of about 30 had come up to the table, his eyes bright, staring down at them warmly. Well, we're on our way, he said to Erickson. Hello, Mara. He pulled out a chair and sat down quickly, folding his hands on the table before him. He noticed Thatcher and drew back a little. Pardon me, he murmured. Bob Thatcher is my name, Thatcher said. I hope I'm not intruding here. He glanced around at the three of them, Mara, alert, watching him intently, heavy-set Erickson, his face blank, and this person. Say, do you three know each other? He asked suddenly. There was silence. The robot attendant slid over soundlessly, poised to take their orders. Erickson roused himself. Let's see, he murmured. What will we have? Mara. Whiskey and water. You, Jan. The bright slim man smiled. The same. Thatcher. Gin and tonic. Whiskey and water for me, also, Erickson said. The robot attendant went off. It returned at once with the drinks, setting them on the table. Each took his own. Well, Erickson said, holding his glass up. To our mutual success. All drank, Thatcher and the three of them, heavy-set Erickson, Mara, her eyes nervous and alert, Jan, who had just come. Again a look passed between Mara and Erickson, a look so swift that he would not have caught it had he not been looking directly at her. What line do you represent, Mr. Erickson? Thatcher asked. Erickson glanced at him, then down at the sample case on the floor. He grunted. Well, as you can see, I'm a salesman. Thatcher smiled. I knew it. You get so you can always spot a salesman right off by his sample case. A salesman always has to carry something to show. What are you in, sir? Erickson paused. He licked his thick lips, his eyes blank and lidded, like a toad's. At last he rubbed his mouth with his hand and reached down, lifting up the sample case. He set it on the table in front of him. Well, he said. Perhaps we might even show Mr. Thatcher. They all stared down at the sample case. It seemed to be an ordinary leather case, with a metal handle and a snap lock. I'm getting curious, Thatcher said. What's in there? You're all so tense. Diamonds? Stolen jewels? Jan laughed harshly, mirthlessly. Eric, put it down. We're not far enough away, yet. Nonsense, Eric rumbled. We're away, January. Please, Mara whispered. Wait, Eric. Wait. Why? What for? You're so accustomed to. Eric, Mara said. She nodded toward Thatcher. We don't know him, Eric. Please. He's a Terran, isn't he? Erickson said. All Terrans are together in these times. He fumbled suddenly at the catch lock on the case. Yes, Mr. Thatcher. I'm a salesman. We're all salesmen, the three of us. Then you do know each other. Yes. Erickson nodded. His two companions sat rigidly, staring down. Yes, we do. Here, I'll show you our line. He opened the case. From it he took a letter knife, a pencil sharpener, a glass globe paperweight, a box of thumb tacks, a stapler, some clips, a plastic ashtray, and some things Thatcher could not identify. He placed the objects in a row in front of him on the tabletop. Then he closed the sample case. I gather you're in office supplies, Thatcher said. He touched the letter knife with his finger. Nice quality steel. Looks like Swedish steel, to me. Erickson nodded, looking into Thatcher's face. Not really an impressive business, is it? Office supplies. Ashtrays, paper clips. He smiled. Oh, Thatcher shrugged. Why not? They're a necessity in modern business. The only thing I wonder. What's that? Well, I wonder how you'd ever find enough customers on Mars to make it worth your while. He paused, examining the glass paperweight. He lifted it up, holding it to the light, staring at the scene within until Erickson took it out of his hand and put it back in the sample case. And another thing. If you three know each other, why did you sit apart when you got on? They looked at him quickly. And why didn't you speak to each other until we left Deimos? He leaned toward Erickson, smiling at him. 2 men and a woman. 3 of you. Sitting apart in the ship. Not speaking, not until the check station was passed. I find myself thinking over what the Martian said. 3 saboteurs. A woman and 2 men. Erickson put the things back in the sample case. He was smiling, but his face had gone chalk white. Mara stared down, playing with a drop of water on the edge of her glass. Jan clenched his hands together nervously, blinking rapidly. You 3 are the ones the lighter was after, Thatcher said softly. You are the destroyers, the saboteurs. But their lie detector, why didn't it trap you? How did you get by that? And now you're safe, outside the check station. He grinned, staring around at them. I'll be damned. And I really thought you were a salesman, Erickson. You really fooled me. Erickson relaxed a little. Well, Mr. Thatcher, it's in a good cause. I'm sure you have no love for Mars, either. No Terran does. And I see you're leaving with the rest of us. True, Thatcher said. You must certainly have an interesting account to give, the 3 of you. He looked around the table. We still have an hour or so of travel. Sometimes it gets dull, this Mars Terra run. Nothing to see, nothing to do but sit and drink in the lounge. He raised his eyes slowly. Any chance you'd like to spin a story to keep us awake? Jan and Mara looked at Erickson. Go on, Jan said. He knows who we are. Tell him the rest of the story. You might as well, Mara said. Jan let out a sigh suddenly, a sigh of relief. Let's put the cards on the table, get this weight off us. I'm tired of sneaking around, slipping. Sure, Erickson said expansively. Why not? He settled back in his chair, unbuttoning his vest. Certainly, Mr. Thatcher. I'll be glad to spin you a story. And I'm sure it will be interesting enough to keep you awake. They ran through the groves of dead trees, leaping across the sun-baked Martian soil, running silently together. They went up a little rise, across a narrow ridge. Suddenly Eric stopped, throwing himself down flat on the ground. The others did the same, pressing themselves against the soil, gasping for breath. Be silent, Eric muttered. He raised himself a little. No noise. There'll be lighters nearby, from now on. We don't dare take any chances. Between the 3 people lying in the grove of dead trees and the city was a barren, level waste of desert, over a mile of blasted sand. No trees or bushes marred the smooth, parched surface. Only an occasional wind, a dry wind eddying and twisting, blew the sand up into little rills. A faint odor came to them, a bitter smell of heat and sand, carried by the wind. Eric pointed. Look. The city, there it is. They stared, still breathing deeply from their race through the trees. The city was close, closer than they had ever seen it before. Never had they gotten so close to it in times past. Terrans were never allowed near the great Martian cities, the centers of Martian life. Even in ordinary times, when there was no threat of approaching war, the Martians shrewdly kept all Terrans away from their citadels, partly from fear, partly from a deep, innate sense of hostility toward the white-skinned visitors whose commercial ventures had earned them the respect, and the dislike, of the whole system. How does it look to you? Eric said. The city was huge, much larger than they had imagined from the drawings and models they had studied so carefully back in New York, in the War Ministry office. Huge it was, huge and stark, black towers rising up against the sky, incredibly thin columns of ancient metal, columns that had stood wind and sun for centuries. Around the city was a wall of stone, red stone, immense bricks that had been lugged there and fitted into place by slaves of the early Martian dynasties, under the whiplash of the first great kings of Mars. An ancient, sun-baked city, a city set in the middle of a wasted plain, beyond groves of dead trees, a city seldom seen by Terrans, but a city studied on maps and charts in every war office on Terra. A city that contained, for all its ancient stone and archaic towers, the ruling group of all Mars, the council of senior leaders, black-clad men who governed and ruled with an iron hand. The senior leaders, 12 fanatic and devoted men, black priests, but priests with flashing rods of fire, lie detectors, rocket ships, intraspace cannon, many more things the Terran Senate could only conjecture about. The senior leaders and their subordinate province leaders, Eric and the two behind him suppressed a shudder. "We've got to be careful," Eric said again. "We'll be passing among them, soon. If they guess who we are, or what we're here for." He snapped open the case he carried, glancing inside for a second. Then he closed it again, grasping the handle firmly. "Let's go," he said. He stood up slowly. "You two come up beside me. I want to make sure you look the way you should." Mara and Jan stepped quickly ahead. Eric studied them critically as the three of them walked slowly down the slope, onto the plain, toward the towering black spires of the city. "Jan," Eric said. "Take hold of her hand. Remember, you're going to marry her, she's your bride. And Martian peasants think a lot of their brides." Jan was dressed in the short trousers and coat of the Martian farmer, a knotted rope tied around his waist, a hat on his head to keep off the sun. His skin was dark, colored by dye until it was almost bronze. "You look fine," Eric said to him. He glanced at Mara. Her black hair was tied in a knot, looped through a hollowed-out yucca bone. Her face was dark, too, dark and lined with colored ceremonial pigment, green and orange stripes across her cheeks. Earrings were strung through her ears. On her feet were tiny slippers of Peru hide, laced around her ankles, and she wore long translucent Martian trousers with a bright sash tied around her waist. Between her small breasts a chain of stone beads rested, good luck charms for the coming marriage. "All right," Eric said. He, himself, wore the flowing gray robe of a Martian priest, dirty robes that were supposed to remain on him all his life, to be buried around him when he died. "I think we'll get past the guards. There should be heavy morning traffic on the road." They walked on, the hard sand crunching under their feet. Against the horizon they could see specks moving, other persons going toward the city, farmers and peasants and merchants, bringing their crops and goods to market. "See the cart!" Mara exclaimed. They were nearing a narrow road, 2 ruts worn into the sand. A Martian hufa was pulling the cart, its great sides wet with perspiration, its tongue hanging out. The cart was piled high with bales of cloth, rough country cloth, hand-dipped. A bent farmer urged the hufa on. "And there." She pointed, smiling. A group of merchants riding small animals were moving along behind the cart, Martians in long robes, their faces hidden by sand masks. On each animal was a pack, carefully tied on with rope. And beyond the merchants, plodding dully along, were peasants and farmers in an endless procession, some riding carts or animals, but mostly on foot. Mara and Jan and Eric joined the line of people, melting in behind the merchants. No one noticed them, no one looked up or gave any sign. The march continued as before. Neither Jan nor Mara said anything to each other. They walked a little behind Eric, who paced with a certain dignity, a certain bearing becoming his position. Once he slowed down, pointing up at the sky. "Look," he murmured, in the Martian hill dialect. "See that?" 2 black dots circled lazily. Martian patrol craft, the military on the outlook for any sign of unusual activity. War was almost ready to break out with Terra. Any day, almost any moment. We'll be just in time, Eric said. Tomorrow will be too late. The last ship will have left Mars. I hope nothing stops us, Mara said. I want to get back home when we're through. Half an hour passed. They neared the city, the wall growing as they walked, rising higher and higher until it seemed to blot out the sky itself. A vast wall, a wall of eternal stone that had felt the wind and sun for centuries. A group of Martian soldiers were standing at the entrance, the single passage gate hewn into the rock, leading to the city. As each person went through, the soldiers examined him, poking his garments, looking into his load. Eric tensed. The line had slowed almost to a halt. It'll be our turn, soon, he murmured. Be prepared. Let's hope no lighters come around, Jan said. The soldiers aren't so bad. Mara was staring up at the wall and the towers beyond. Under their feet the ground trembled, vibrating and shaking. She could see tongues of flame rising from the towers, from the deep underground factories and forges of the city. The air was thick and dense with particles of soot. Mara rubbed her mouth, coughing. Here they come, Eric said softly. The merchants had been examined and allowed to pass through the dark gate, the entrance through the wall into the city. They and their silent animals had already disappeared inside. The leader of the group of soldiers was beckoning impatiently to Eric, waving him on. Come along, he said. Hurry up there, old man. Eric advanced slowly, his arms wrapped around his body, looking down at the ground. Who are you and what's your business here? The soldier demanded, his hands on his hips, his gun hanging idly at his waist. Most of the soldiers were lounging lazily, leaning against the wall, some even squatting in the shade. Flies crawled on the face of one who had fallen asleep, his gun on the ground beside him. My business? Eric murmured. I am a village priest. Why do you want to enter the city? I must bring these two people before the magistrate to marry them. He indicated Mara and Jan, standing a little behind him. That is the law the lighters have made. The soldier laughed. He circled around Eric. What do you have in that bag you carry? Laundry. We stay the night. What village are you from? Kronos. Kronos? The soldier looked to a companion. Ever heard of Kronos? A backward pig-sty. I saw it once on a hunting trip. The leader of the soldiers nodded to Jan and Mara. The two of them advanced, their hands clasped, standing close together. One of the soldiers put his hand on Mara's bare shoulder, turning her around. Nice little wife you're getting, he said. Good and firm looking. He winked, grinning lewdly. Jan glanced at him in sullen resentment. The soldiers guffawed. All right, the leader said to Eric. You people can pass. Eric took a small purse from his robes and gave the soldier a coin. Then the three of them went into the dark tunnel that was the entrance, passing through the wall of stone, into the city beyond. They were within the city. Now, Eric whispered. Hurry. Around them the city roared and cracked, the sound of 1,000 vents and machines, shaking the stones under their feet. Eric led Mara and Jan into a corner, by a row of brick warehouses. People were everywhere, hurrying back and forth, shouting above the din, merchants, peddlers, soldiers, street women. Eric bent down and opened the case he carried. From the case he quickly took 3 small coils of fine metal, intricate meshed wires and veins worked together into a small cone. Jan took one and Mara took one. Eric put the remaining cone into his robe and snapped the case shut again. Now remember, the coils must be buried in such a way that the line runs through the center of the city. We must trisect the main section, where the largest concentration of buildings is. Remember the maps. Watch the alleys and streets carefully. Talk to no one if you can help it. Each of you has enough Martian money to buy your way out of trouble. Watch especially for cut purses, and for heaven's sake, don't get lost. Eric broke off. Two black-clad lighters were coming along the inside of the wall, strolling together with their hands behind their backs. They noticed the three who stood in the corner by the warehouses and stopped. "Go," Eric muttered. "And be back here at sundown." He smiled grimly. "Or never come back." Each went off a different way, walking quickly without looking back. The lighters watched them go. "The little bride was quite lovely," one lighter said. "Those hill people have the stamp of nobility in their blood, from the old times. A very lucky young peasant to possess her," the other said. They went on. Eric looked after them, still smiling a little. Then he joined the surging mass of people that milled eternally through the streets of the city. At dusk they met outside the gate. The sun was soon to set, and the air had turned thin and frigid. It cut through their clothing like knives. Mara huddled against Jan, trembling and rubbing her bare arms. "Well?" Eric said. "Did you both succeed?" Around them peasants and merchants were pouring from the entrance, leaving the city to return to their farms and villages, starting the long trip back across the plain toward the hills beyond. None of them noticed the shivering girl and the young man and the old priest standing by the wall. "Mine's in place," Jan said. "On the other side of the city, on the extreme edge. Buried by a well." "Mine's in the industrial section," Mara whispered, her teeth chattering. "Jan, give me something to put over me. I'm freezing." "Good," Eric said. "Then the 3 coils should trisect dead center, if the models were correct." He looked up at the darkening sky. Already, stars were beginning to show. 2 dots, the evening patrol, moved slowly toward the horizon. "Let's hurry. It won't be long." They joined the line of Martians moving along the road, away from the city. Behind them the city was losing itself in the somber tones of night, its black spires disappearing into darkness. They walked silently with the country people until the flat ridge of dead trees became visible on the horizon. Then they left the road and turned off, walking toward the trees. "Almost time," Eric said. He increased his pace, looking back at Jan and Mara impatiently. "Come on." They hurried, making their way through the twilight, stumbling over rocks and dead branches, up the side of the ridge. At the top Eric halted, standing with his hands on his hips, looking back. "See," he murmured. "The city. The last time we'll ever see it this way." "Can I sit down?" Mara said. "My feet hurt me." Jan pulled at Eric's sleeve. "Hurry, Eric. Not much time left." He laughed nervously. "If everything goes right we'll be able to look at it, forever." "But not like this," Eric murmured. He squatted down, snapping his case open. He took some tubes and wiring out and assembled them together on the ground, at the peak of the ridge. A small pyramid of wire and plastic grew, shaped by his expert hands. At last he grunted, standing up. "All right. Is it pointed directly at the city?" Mara asked anxiously, looking down at the pyramid. Eric nodded. "Yes, it's placed according." He stopped, suddenly stiffening. "Get back. It's time. Hurry." Jan ran, down the far side of the slope, away from the city, pulling Mara with him. Eric came quickly after, still looking back at the distant spires, almost lost in the night sky. "Down." Jan sprawled out, Mara beside him, her trembling body pressed against his. Eric settled down into the sand and dead branches, still trying to see. "I want to see it," he murmured. "A miracle. I want to see." A flash, a blinding burst of violet light, lit up the sky. Eric clapped his hands over his eyes. The flash whitened, growing larger, expanding. Suddenly there was a roar, and a furious hot wind rushed past him, throwing him on his face in the sand. The hot dry wind licked and seared at them, crackling the bits of branches into flame. Mara and Jan shut their eyes, pressed tightly together. "God," Eric muttered. The storm passed. They opened their eyes slowly. The sky was still alive with fire, a drifting cloud of sparks that was beginning to dissipate with the night wind. Eric stood up unsteadily, helping Jan and Mara to their feet. The three of them stood, staring silently across the dark waste, the black plain, none of them speaking. The city was gone. At last Eric turned away. "That part's done," he said. "Now the rest. Give me a hand, January. There'll be 1,000 patrol ships around here in a minute." "I see one already," Mara said, pointing up. A spot winked in the sky, a rapidly moving spot. "They're coming, Eric." There was a throb of chill fear in her voice. "I know." Eric and Jan squatted on the ground around the pyramid of tubes and plastic, pulling the pyramid apart. The pyramid was fused together like molten glass. Eric tore the pieces away with trembling fingers. From the remains of the pyramid he pulled something forth, something he held up high, trying to make it out in the darkness. Jan and Mara came close to see, both staring up intently, almost without breathing. "There it is," Eric said. "There." In his hand was a globe, a small transparent globe of glass. Within the glass something moved, something minute and fragile, spires almost too small to be seen, microscopic, a complex web swimming within the hollow glass globe. A web of spires. A city. Eric put the globe into the case and snapped it shut. "Let's go," he said. They began to lope back through the trees, back the way they had come before. "We'll change in the car," he said as they ran. "I think we should keep these clothes on until we're actually inside the car. We still might encounter someone." "I'll be glad to get my own clothing on again," Jan said. "I feel funny in these little pants." "How do you think I feel?" Mara gasped. "I'm freezing in this, what there is of it." "All young Martian brides dress that way," Eric said. He clutched the case tightly as they ran. "I think it looks fine." "Thank you," Mara said, "but it is cold." "What do you suppose they'll think?" Jan asked. "They'll assume the city was destroyed, won't they?" "That's certain." "Yes," Eric said. "They'll be sure it was blown up. We can count on that. And it will be damn important to us that they think so." "The car should be around here, someplace," Mara said, slowing down. "No. Farther on," Eric said. "Past that little hill over there. In the ravine, by the trees. It's so hard to see where we are." "Shall I light something?" Jan said. "No. There may be patrols around who." He halted abruptly. Jan and Mara stopped beside him. "What?" Mara began. A light glimmered. Something stirred in the darkness. There was a sound. "Quick!" Eric rasped. He dropped, throwing the case far away from him, into the bushes. He straightened up tensely. A figure loomed up, moving through the darkness, and behind it came more figures, men, soldiers in uniform. The light flashed up brightly, blinding them. Eric closed his eyes. The light left him, touching Mara and Jan, standing silently together, clasping hands. Then it flicked down to the ground and around in a circle. A lighter stepped forward, a tall figure in black, with his soldiers close behind him, their guns ready. "You three," the lighter said. "Who are you? Don't move. Stand where you are." He came up to Eric, peering at him intently, his hard Martian face without expression. He went all around Eric, examining his robes, his sleeves. "Please," Eric began in a quavering voice, but the lighter cut him off. "I'll do the talking. Who are you three? What are you doing here? Speak up." We are going back to our village," Eric muttered, staring down, his hands folded. "We were in the city, and now we are going home." One of the soldiers spoke into a mouthpiece. He clicked it off and put it away. "Come with me," the lighter said. We're taking you in. Hurry along. In. Back to the city. One of the soldiers laughed. The city is gone, he said. All that's left of it you can put in the palm of your hand. But what happened? Mara said. No one knows. Come on, hurry it up. There was a sound. A soldier came quickly out of the darkness. A senior lighter, he said. Coming this way. He disappeared again. A senior lighter. The soldiers stood waiting, standing at a respectful attention. A moment later the senior lighter stepped into the light, a black-clad old man, his ancient face thin and hard, like a bird's, eyes bright and alert. He looked from Eric to Jan. Who are these people? He demanded. Villagers going back home. No, they're not. They don't stand like villagers. Villagers slump, diet, poor food. These people are not villagers. I myself came from the hills, and I know. He stepped close to Eric, looking keenly into his face. Who are you? Look at his chin, he never shaved with a sharpened stone. Something is wrong here. In his hand a rod of pale fire flashed. The city is gone, and with it at least half the lighter council. It is very strange, a flash, then heat, and a wind. But it was not fission. I am puzzled. All at once the city has vanished. Nothing is left but a depression in the sand. We'll take them in, the other lighter said. Soldiers, surround them. Make certain that. Run. Eric cried. He struck out, knocking the rod from the senior lighter's hand. They were all running, soldiers shouting, flashing their lights, stumbling against each other in the darkness. Eric dropped to his knees, groping frantically in the bushes. His fingers closed over the handle of the case and he leaped up. In Terran he shouted to Mara and Jan. Hurry! To the car! Run! He set off, down the slope, stumbling through the darkness. He could hear soldiers behind him, soldiers running and falling. A body collided against him and he struck out. Someplace behind him there was a hiss, and a section of the slope went up in flames. The lighter's rod. Eric, Mara cried from the darkness. He ran toward her. Suddenly he slipped, falling on a stone. Confusion and firing. The sound of excited voices. Eric, is that you? Jan caught hold of him, helping him up. The car. It's over here. Where's Mara? I'm here, Mara's voice came. Over here, by the car. A light flashed. A tree went up in a puff of fire, and Eric felt the singe of the heat against his face. He and Jan made their way toward the girl. Mara's hand caught his in the darkness. Now the car, Eric said. If they haven't got to it. He slid down the slope into the ravine, fumbling in the darkness, reaching and holding onto the handle of the case. Reaching. He touched something cold and smooth. Metal, a metal door handle. Relief flooded through him. I found it. Jan, get inside. Mara, come on. He pushed Jan past him, into the car. Mara slipped in after Jan, her small agile body crowding in beside him. Stop, a voice shouted from above. There's no use hiding in that ravine. We'll get you. Come up, Anne. The sound of voices was drowned out by the roar of the car's motor. A moment later they shot into the darkness, the car rising into the air. Treetops broke and cracked under them as Eric turned the car from side to side, avoiding the groping shafts of pale light from below, the last furious thrusts from the two lighters and their soldiers. Then they were away, above the trees, high in the air, gaining speed each moment, leaving the knot of Martians far behind. Toward Marsport, Jan said to Eric. Right? Eric nodded. Yes. We'll land outside the field, in the hills. We can change back to our regular clothing there, our commercial clothing. Damn it, We'll be lucky if we can get there in time for the ship. The last ship, Mara whispered, her chest rising and falling. What if we don't get there in time? Eric looked down at the leather case in his lap. We'll have to get there, he murmured. We must. For a long time there was silence. Thatcher stared at Erickson. The older man was leaning back in his chair, sipping a little of his drink. Mara and Jan were silent. So you didn't destroy the city, Thatcher said. You didn't destroy it at all. You shrank it down and put it in a glass globe, in a paperweight. And now you're salesman again, with a sample case of office supplies. Erickson smiled. He opened the briefcase and reaching into it he brought out the glass globe paperweight. He held it up, looking into it. Yes, we stole the city from the Martians. That's how we got by the lie detector. It was true that we knew nothing about a destroyed city. But why? Thatcher said. Why steal a city? Why not merely bomb it? Ransom, Mara said fervently, gazing into the globe, her dark eyes bright. Their biggest city, half of their council, in Eric's hand. Mars will have to do what Terra asks, Erickson said. Now Terra will be able to make her commercial demands felt. Maybe there won't even be a war. Perhaps Terra will get her way without fighting. Still smiling, he put the globe back into the briefcase and locked it. Quite a story, Thatcher said. What an amazing process, reduction of size, a whole city reduced to microscopic dimensions. Amazing. No wonder you were able to escape. With such daring as that, no one could hope to stop you. He looked down at the briefcase on the floor. Underneath them the jets murmured and vibrated evenly, as the ship moved through space toward distant Terra. We still have quite a way to go, Jan said. You've heard our story, Thatcher. Why not tell us yours? What sort of line are you in? What's your business? Yes, Mara said. What do you do? What do I do? Thatcher said. Well, if you like, I'll show you. He reached into his coat and brought out something. Something that flashed and glinted, something slender. A rod of pale fire. The three stared at it. Sickened shock settled over them slowly. Thatcher held the rod loosely, calmly, pointing it at Erickson. We knew you three were on this ship, he said. There was no doubt of that. But we did not know what had become of the city. My theory was that the city had not been destroyed at all, that something else had happened to it. Council instruments measured a sudden loss of mass in that area, a decrease equal to the mass of the city. Somehow the city had been spirited away, not destroyed. But I could not convince the other council leaders of it. I had to follow you alone. Thatcher turned a little, nodding to the men sitting at the bar. The men rose at once, coming toward the table. A very interesting process you have. Mars will benefit a great deal from it. Perhaps it will even turn the tide in our favor. When we return to Marsport I wish to begin work on it at once. And now, if you will please pass me the briefcase. The Golden Man. The powers of Earth had finally exterminated the last of the horrible tribes of mutant freaks spawned by atomic war. Menace to Homo sapien supremacy was about ended, but not quite. For out of the countryside came a great golden, godlike youth whose extraordinary mutant powers, combining the world's oldest and newest methods of survival, promised a new and superior type of mankind. Is it always hot like this? The salesman demanded. He addressed everybody at the lunch counter and in the shabby booths against the wall. A middle-aged fat man with a good-natured smile, rumpled gray suit, sweat-stained white shirt, a drooping bow tie, and a Panama hat. Only in the summer, the waitress answered. None of the others stirred. The teenage boy and girl in one of the booths, eyes fixed intently on each other. Two workmen, sleeves rolled up, arms dark and hairy, eating bean soup and rolls. A lean, weathered farmer. An elderly businessman in a blue serge suit, vest and pocket watch. A dark rat-faced cab driver drinking coffee. A tired woman who had come in to get off her feet and put down her bundles. The salesman got out a package of cigarettes. He glanced curiously around the dingy cafe, lit up, leaned his arms on the counter, and said to the man next to him, "What's the name of this town?" The man grunted. Walnut Creek. The salesman sipped at his Coke for a while, cigarette held loosely between plump white fingers. Presently he reached in his coat and brought out a leather wallet. For a long time he leafed thoughtfully through cards and papers, bits of notes, ticket stubs, endless odds and ends, soiled fragments, and finally a photograph. He grinned at the photograph, and then began to chuckle, a low moist rasp. "Look at this," he said to the man beside him. The man went on reading his newspaper. "Hey, look at this." The salesman nudged him with his elbow and pushed the photograph at him. "How's that strike you?" Annoyed, the man glanced briefly at the photograph. It showed a nude woman, from the waist up. Perhaps 35 years old. Face turned away. Body white and flabby. With 8 breasts. Ever seen anything like that? The salesman chuckled, his little red eyes dancing. His face broke into lewd smiles and again he nudged the man. "I've seen that before." Disgusted, the man resumed reading his newspaper. The salesman noticed the lean old farmer was looking at the picture. He passed it genially over to him. "How's that strike you, Pop? Pretty good stuff, eh?" The farmer examined the picture solemnly. He turned it over, studied the creased back, took a second look at the front, then tossed it to the salesman. It slid from the counter, turned over a couple of times, and fell to the floor face up. The salesman picked it up and brushed it off. Carefully, almost tenderly, he restored it to his wallet. The waitress' eyes flickered as she caught a glimpse of it. "Damn nice," the salesman observed, with a wink. "Wouldn't you say so?" The waitress shrugged indifferently. "I don't know. I saw a lot of them around Denver. A whole colony. That's where this was taken. Denver DCA camp." "Any still alive?" the farmer asked. The salesman laughed harshly. "You kidding?" He made a short, sharp swipe with his hand. "Not anymore." They were all listening. Even the high school kids in the booth had stopped holding hands and were sitting up straight, eyes wide with fascination. "Saw a funny kind down near San Diego," the farmer said. "Last year, sometime. Had wings like a bat. Skin, not feathers. Skin and bone wings." The rat-eyed taxi driver chimed in. "That's nothing. There was a 2-headed one in Detroit. I saw it on exhibit." "Was it alive?" the waitress asked. "No. They'd already used it." In sociology, the high school boy spoke up, "We saw tapes of a whole lot of them. The winged kind from down south, the big-headed one they found in Germany, an awful-looking one with sort of cones, like an insect. And the worst of all, the elderly businessmen stated, are those English ones. That hid out in the coal mines. The ones they didn't find until last year." He shook his head. 40 years, down there in the mines, breeding and developing. Almost 100 of them. Survivors from a group that went underground during the war. They just found a new kind in Sweden, the waitress said. "I was reading about it. Controls mines at a distance," they said. "Only a couple of them. The DCA got there plenty fast." "That's a variation of the New Zealand type," one of the workmen said. "It read minds." "Reading and controlling are 2 different things," the businessman said. "When I hear something like that I'm plenty glad there's the DCA. There was a type they found right after the war," the farmer said. "In Siberia. Had the ability to control objects. Psychokinetic ability. The Soviet DCA got it right away. Nobody remembers that anymore." "I remember that," the businessman said. "I was just a kid, then. I remember because that was the first div I ever heard of. My father called me into the living room and told me and my brothers and sisters. We were still building the house. That was in the days when the DCA inspected everyone and stamped their arms. He held up his thin, gnarled wrist. I was stamped there, 60 years ago. Now they just have the birth inspection, the waitress said. She shivered. There was one in San Francisco this month. First in over a year. They thought it was over, around here. It's been dwindling, the taxi driver said. Frisco wasn't too bad hit. Not like some. Not like Detroit. They still get 10 or 15 a year in Detroit, the high school boy said. All around there. Lots of pools still left. People go into them, in spite of the robot signs. What kind was this one? The salesman asked. The one they found in San Francisco. The waitress gestured. Common type. The kind with no toes. Bent over. Big eyes. The nocturnal type, the salesman said. The mother had hit it. They say it was 3 years old. She got the doctor to forge the DCA chit. Old friend of the family. The salesman had finished his coke. He sat playing idly with his cigarettes, listening to the hum of talk he had set into motion. The high school boy was leaning excitedly toward the girl across from him, impressing her with his fund of knowledge. The lean farmer and the businessman were huddled together, remembering the old days, the last years of the war, before the first 10-year Reconstruction plan. The taxi driver and the 2 workmen were swapping yarns about their own experiences. The salesman caught the waitress's attention. I guess, he said thoughtfully, that one in Frisco caused quite a stir. Something like that happening so close. Yeah, the waitress murmured. This side of the bay wasn't really hit, the salesman continued. You never get any of them over here. No. The waitress moved abruptly. None in this area. Ever. She scooped up dirty dishes from the counter and headed toward the back. Never, the salesman asked, surprised. You've never had any divs on this side of the bay? No. None. She disappeared into the back, where the fry cook stood by his burners, white apron and tattooed wrists. Her voice was a little too loud, a little too harsh and strained. It made the farmer pause suddenly and glance up. Silence dropped like a curtain. All sound cut off instantly. They were all gazing down at their food, suddenly tense and ominous. None around here, the taxi driver said, loudly and clearly, to no one in particular. None ever. Sure, the salesman agreed genially. I was only. Make sure you get that straight, one of the workmen said. The salesman blinked. Sure, buddy. Sure. He fumbled nervously in his pocket. A quarter and a dime jangled to the floor and he hurriedly scooped them up. No offense. For a moment there was silence. Then the high school boy spoke up, aware for the first time that nobody was saying anything. I heard something, he began eagerly, voice full of importance. Somebody said they saw something up by the Johnson farm that looked like it was one of those. Shut up, the businessman said, without turning his head. Scarlet-faced, the boy sagged in his seat. His voice wavered and broke off. He peered hastily down at his hands and swallowed unhappily. The salesman paid the waitress for his coke. What's the quickest road to Frisco? He began. But the waitress had already turned her back. The people at the counter were immersed in their food. None of them looked up. They ate in frozen silence. Hostile, unfriendly faces, intent on their food. The salesman picked up his bulging briefcase, pushed open the screen door, and stepped out into the blazing sunlight. He moved toward his battered 1978 Buick, parked a few meters up. A blue-shirt traffic cop was standing in the shade of an awning, talking languidly to a young woman in a yellow silk dress that clung moistly to her slim body. The salesman paused a moment before he got into his car. He waved his hand and hailed the policeman. "Say, you know this town pretty good?" The policeman eyed the salesman's rumpled gray suit, bow tie, his sweat-stained shirt. "The out-of-state license." "What do you want?" "I'm looking for the Johnson farm," the salesman said. "Here to see him about some litigation." He moved toward the policeman, a small white card between his fingers. "I'm his attorney, from the New York Guild. Can you tell me how to get out there? I haven't been through here in a couple of years." Nat Johnson gazed up at the noonday sun and saw that it was good. He sat sprawled out on the bottom step of the porch, a pipe between his yellowed teeth, a lithe, wiry man in red checkered shirt and canvas jeans, powerful hands, iron-gray hair that was still thick despite 65 years of active life. He was watching the children play. Jean rushed laughing in front of him, bosom heaving under her sweatshirt, black hair streaming behind her. She was 16, bright-eyed, legs strong and straight, slim young body bent slightly forward with the weight of the two horseshoes. After her scampered Dave, 14, white teeth and black hair, a handsome boy, a son to be proud of. Dave caught up with his sister, passed her, and reached the far peg. He stood waiting, legs apart, hands on his hips, his two horseshoes gripped easily. Gasping, Jean hurried toward him. "Go ahead." Dave shouted. "You shoot first. I'm waiting for you. So you can knock them away. So I can knock them closer." Jean tossed down one horseshoe and gripped the other with both hands, eyes on the distant peg. Her lithe body bent, one leg slid back, her spine arched. She took careful aim, closed one eye, and then expertly tossed the shoe. With a clang the shoe struck the distant peg, circled briefly around it, then bounced off again and rolled to one side. A cloud of dust rolled up. "Not bad," Nat Johnson admitted, from his step. "Too hard, though. Take it easy." His chest swelled with pride as the girl's glistening body took aim and again threw. Two powerful, handsome children, almost ripe, on the verge of adulthood. Playing together in the hot sun. And there was Chris. Chris stood by the porch, arms folded. He wasn't playing. He was watching. He had stood there since Dave and Jean had begun playing, the same half-intent, half-remote expression on his finely cut face. As if he were seeing past them, beyond the two of them. Beyond the field, the barn, the creek bed, the rows of cedars. "Come on, Chris." Jean called, as she and Dave moved across the field to collect their horseshoes. "Don't you want to play?" No, Chris didn't want to play. He never played. He was off in a world of his own, a world into which none of them could come. He never joined in anything, games or chores or family activities. He was by himself always. Remote, detached, aloof. Seeing past everyone and everything, that is, until all at once something clicked and he momentarily rephased, re-entered their world briefly. Nat Johnson reached out and knocked his pipe against the step. He refilled it from his leather tobacco pouch, his eyes on his eldest son. Chris was now moving into life. Heading out onto the field. He walked slowly, arms folded calmly, as if he had, for the moment, descended from his own world into theirs. Jean didn't see him, she had turned her back and was getting ready to pitch. "Hey," Dave said, startled. "Here's Chris." Chris reached his sister, stopped, and held out his hand. A great dignified figure, calm and impassive. Uncertainly, Jean gave him one of the horseshoes. "You want this? You want to play?" Chris said nothing. He bent slightly, a supple arc of his incredibly graceful body, then moved his arm in a blur of speed. The shoe sailed, struck the far peg, and dizzily spun around it. Ringer. The corners of Dave's mouth turned down. "What a lousy darn thing." "Chris," Jean reproved. "You don't play fair." No, Chris didn't play fair. He had watched half an hour, then come out and thrown once. One perfect toss, one dead ringer. He never makes a mistake, Dave complained. Chris stood, face blank. A golden statue in the midday sun. Golden hair, skin, a light down of gold fuzz on his bare arms and legs. Abruptly he stiffened. Nat sat up, startled. What is it? He barked. Chris turned in a quick circle, magnificent body alert. Chris! Jean demanded. What? Chris shot forward. Like a released energy beam he bounded across the field, over the fence, into the barn and out the other side. His flying figure seemed to skim over the dry grass as he descended into the barren creek bed, between the cedars. A momentary flash of gold, and he was gone. Vanished. There was no sound. No motion. He had utterly melted into the scenery. What was it this time? Jean asked wearily. She came over to her father and threw herself down in the shade. Sweat glowed on her smooth neck and upper lip, her sweat shirt was streaked and damp. What did he see? He was after something, Dave stated, coming up. Nat grunted. Maybe. There's no telling. I guess I better tell Mom not to set a place for him, Jean said. He probably won't be back. Anger and futility descended over Nat Johnson. No, he wouldn't be back. Not for dinner and probably not the next day, or the one after that. He'd be gone God only knew how long. Or where. Or why. Off by himself, alone someplace. If I thought there was any use, Nat began, I'd send you two after him. But there's no. He broke off. A car was coming up the dirt road toward the farmhouse. A dusty, battered old Buick. Behind the wheel sat a plump red-faced man in a gray suit, who waved cheerfully at them as the car sputtered to a stop and the motor died into silence. Afternoon, the man nodded, as he climbed out the car. He tipped his hat pleasantly. He was middle-aged, genial-looking, perspiring freely as he crossed the dry ground toward the porch. Maybe you folks can help me. What do you want? Nat Johnson demanded hoarsely. He was frightened. He watched the creek bed out of the corner of his eye, praying silently. God, if only he stayed away. Jean was breathing quickly, sharp little gasps. She was terrified. Dave's face was expressionless, but all color had drained from it. Who are you? Nat demanded. Name's Baines. George Baines. The man held out his hand but Johnson ignored it. Maybe you've heard of me. I own the Pacifica Development Corporation. We built all those little bomb-proof houses just outside town. Those little round ones you see as you come up the main highway from Lafayette. What do you want? Johnson held his hand steady with an effort. He'd never heard of the man, although he'd noticed the housing tract. It couldn't be missed, a great ant heap of ugly pillboxes straddling the highway. Baines looked like the kind of man who'd own them. But what did he want here? I've bought some land up this way, Baines was explaining. He rattled a sheaf of crisp papers. This is the deed, but I'll be damned if I can find it. He grinned good-naturedly. I know it's around this way, someplace, this side of the state road. According to the clerk at the county recorder's office, a mile or so this side of that hill over there. But I'm no damn good at reading maps. It isn't around here, Dave broke in. There's only farms around here. Nothing for sale. This is a farm, son, Baines said genially. I bought it for myself and my missus. So we could settle down. He wrinkled his pug nose. Don't get the wrong idea, I'm not putting up any tracks around here. This is strictly for myself. An old farmhouse, 20 acres, a pump and a few oak trees. Let me see the deed. Johnson grabbed the sheaf of papers, and while Baines blinked in astonishment, he leafed rapidly through them. His face hardened and he handed them back. What are you up to? This deed is for a parcel 50 miles from here. 50 miles. Baines was dumbfounded. No kidding. But the clerk told me. Johnson was on his feet. He towered over the fat man. He was in top-notch physical shape, and he was plenty damn suspicious. Clerk, hell. You get back into your car and drive out of here. I don't know what you're after, or what you're here for, but I want you off my land. In Johnson's massive fist something sparkled. A metal tube that gleamed ominously in the midday sunlight. Baines saw it, and gulped. No offense, mister. He backed nervously away. You folks sure are touchy. Take it easy, will you? Johnson said nothing. He gripped the lash tube tighter and waited for the fat man to leave. But Baines lingered. Look, buddy. I've been driving around this furnace 5 hours, looking for my damn place. Any objection to my using your facilities? Johnson eyed him with suspicion. Gradually the suspicion turned to disgust. He shrugged. Dave, show him where the bathroom is. Thanks. Baines grinned thankfully. And if it wouldn't be too much trouble, maybe a glass of water. I'd be glad to pay you for it. He chuckled knowingly. Never let the city people get away with anything, eh? Christ. Johnson turned away in revulsion as the fat man lumbered after his son, into the house. Dad, Jean whispered. As soon as Baines was inside she hurried up onto the porch, eyes wide with fear. Dad, do you think he... Johnson put his arm around her. Just hold on tight. He'll be gone, soon. The girl's dark eyes flashed with mute terror. Every time the man from the water company, or the tax collector, some tramp, children, anybody come around, I get a terrible stab of pain, here. She clutched at her heart, hand against her breasts. It's been that way 13 years. How much longer can we keep it going? How long? The man named Baines emerged gratefully from the bathroom. Dave Johnson stood silently by the door, body rigid, youthful face stony. Thanks, son, Baines sighed. Now where can I get a glass of cold water? He smacked his thick lips in anticipation. After you've been driving around the sticks looking for a dump some red-hot real estate agent stuck you with. Dave headed into the kitchen. Mom, this man wants a drink of water. Dad said he could have it. Dave had turned his back. Baines caught a brief glimpse of the mother, gray-haired, small, moving toward the sink with a glass, face withered and drawn, without expression. Then Baines hurried from the room down a hall. He passed through a bedroom, pulled a door open, found himself facing a closet. He turned and raced back, through the living room, into a dining room, then another bedroom. In a brief instant he had gone through the whole house. He peered out a window. The backyard. Remains of a rusting truck. Entrance of an underground bomb shelter. Tin cans. Chickens scratching around. A dog, asleep under a shed. A couple of old auto tires. He found a door leading out. Soundlessly, he tore the door open and stepped outside. No one was in sight. There was the barn, a leaning, ancient wood structure. Cedar trees beyond, a creek of some kind. What had once been an outhouse? Baines moved cautiously around the side of the house. He had perhaps 30 seconds. He had left the door of the bathroom closed, the boy would think he had gone back in there. Baines looked into the house through a window. A large closet, filled with old clothing, boxes and bundles of magazines. He turned and started back. He reached the corner of the house and started around it. Nat Johnson's gaunt shape loomed up and blocked his way. All right, Baines. You asked for it. A pink flash blossomed. It shut out the sunlight in a single blinding burst. Baines leaped back and clawed at his coat pocket. The edge of the flash caught him and he half fell, stunned by the force. His suit shield sucked in the energy and discharged it, but the power rattled his teeth and for a moment he jerked like a puppet on a string. Darkness ebbed around him. He could feel the mesh of the shield glow white, as it absorbed the energy and fought to control it. His own tube came out, and Johnson had no shield. "You're under arrest," Baines muttered grimly. "Put down your tube and your hands up. And call your family." He made a motion with the tube. "Come on, Johnson. Make it snappy." The lash tube wavered and then slipped from Johnson's fingers. "You're still alive." Dawning horror crept across his face. "Then you must be." Dave and Jean appeared. "Dad! Come over here," Baines ordered. "Where's your mother?" Dave jerked his head numbly. "Inside. Get her and bring her here." "Your DCA," Nat Johnson whispered. Baines didn't answer. He was doing something with his neck, pulling at the flabby flesh. The wiring of a contact mic glittered as he slipped it from a fold between two chins and into his pocket. From the dirt road came the sound of motors, sleek purrs that rapidly grew louder. 2 teardrops of black metal came gliding up and parked beside the house. Men swarmed out, in the dark gray-green of the government civil police. In the sky swarms of black dots were descending, clouds of ugly flies that darkened the sun as they spilled out men and equipment. The men drifted slowly down. "He's not here," Baines said, as the first man reached him. "He got away. Inform Wisdom back at the lab. We've got this section blocked off." Baines turned to Nat Johnson, who stood in dazed silence, uncomprehending, his son and daughter beside him. "How did he know we were coming?" Baines demanded. "I don't know," Johnson muttered. "He just knew." "A telepath?" "I don't know." Baines shrugged. "We'll know, soon. A clamp is out, all around here. He can't get past, no matter what the hell he can do. Unless he can dematerialize himself." "What'll you do with him if you catch him?" Jean asked huskily. "Study him. And then kill him?" "That depends on the lab evaluation. If you could give me more to work on, I could predict better." "We can't tell you anything. We don't know anything more." The girl's voice rose with desperation. "He doesn't talk." Baines jumped. "What? He doesn't talk. He never talked to us. Ever. How old is he?" 18. No communication. Baines was sweating. "In 18 years there hasn't been any semantic bridge between you. Does he have any contact? Signs? Codes? He ignores us. He eats here, stays with us. Sometimes he plays when we play. Or sits with us. He's gone days on end. We've never been able to find out what he's doing, or where. He sleeps in the barn, by himself." "Is he really gold-colored?" "Yes. Skin, eyes, hair, nails. Everything. And he's large. Well-formed." It was a moment before the girl answered. A strange emotion stirred her drawn features, a momentary glow. "He's incredibly beautiful. A god come down to earth." Her lips twisted. "You won't find him. He can do things. Things you have no comprehension of. Powers so far beyond your limited. You don't think we'll get him?" Baines frowned. "More teams are landing all the time. You've never seen an agency clamp in operation. We've had 60 years to work out all the bugs. If he gets away it'll be the first time." Baines broke off abruptly. 3 men were quickly approaching the porch. 2 green-clad civil police. And a third man between them. A man who moved silently, lively, a faintly luminous shape that towered above them. "Chris!" Jean screamed. "We got him," one of the police said. Baines fingered his lash tube uneasily. "Where? How?" "He gave himself up," the policeman answered, voice full of awe. He came to us voluntarily. Look at him. He's like a metal statue. Like some sort of god. The golden figure halted for a moment beside Jean. Then it turned slowly, calmly, to face Baines. Chris. Jean shrieked. Why did you come back? The same thought was eating at Baines, too. He shoved it aside, for the time being. Is the jet out front? He demanded quickly. Ready to go, one of the CP answered. Fine. Baines strode past them, down the steps and onto the dirt field. Let's go. I want him taken directly to the lab. For a moment he studied the massive figure who stood calmly between the two civil policemen. Beside him, they seemed to have shrunk, become ungainly and repellent. Like dwarves. What had Jean said? A god come to earth. Baines broke angrily away. Come on, he muttered brusquely. This one may be tough, we've never run up against one like it before. We don't know what the hell it can do. The chamber was empty, except for the seated figure. For bare walls, floor and ceiling. A steady glare of white light relentlessly etched every corner of the chamber. Near the top of the far wall ran a narrow slot, the view windows through which the interior of the chamber was scanned. The seated figure was quiet. He hadn't moved since the chamber locks had slid into place, since the heavy bolts had fallen from outside and the rows of bright-faced technicians had taken their places at the view windows. He gazed down at the floor, bent forward, hands clasped together, face calm, almost expressionless. In 4 hours he hadn't moved a muscle. Well? Baines said. What have you learned? Wisdom grunted sourly. Not much. If we don't have him doped out in 48 hours we'll go ahead with the youth. We can't take any chances. You're thinking about the Tunis type, Baines said. He was, too. They had found 10 of them, living in the ruins of the abandoned North African town. Their survival method was simple. They killed and absorbed other life forms, then imitated them and took their places. Chameleons, they were called. It had cost 60 lives, before the last one was destroyed. 60 top-level experts, highly trained DCA men. Any clues? Baines asked. He's different as hell. This is going to be tough. Wisdom thumbed a pile of tape spools. This is the complete report, all the material we got from Johnson and his family. We pumped them with the psych wash, then let them go home. 18 years, and no semantic bridge. Yet, he looks fully developed. Mature at 13, a shorter, faster life cycle than ours. But why the mane? All the gold fuzz? Like a Roman monument that's been gilded. Has the report come in from the analysis room? You had a wave shot taken, of course. His brain pattern has been fully scanned. But it takes time for them to plot it out. We're all running around like lunatics while he just sits there. Wisdom poked a stubby finger at the window. We caught him easily enough. He can't have much, can he? But I'd like to know what it is. Before we youth him. Maybe we should keep him alive until we know. Youth in 48 hours, Wisdom repeated stubbornly. Whether we know or not. I don't like him. He gives me the creeps. Wisdom stood chewing nervously on his cigar, a red-haired, beefy-faced man, thick and heavy-set, with a barrel chest and cold, shrewd eyes deep-set in his hard face. Ed Wisdom was director of DCA's North American branch. But right now he was worried. His tiny eyes darted back and forth, alarmed flickers of gray in his brutal, massive face. You think, Baines said slowly, this is it? I always think so, Wisdom snapped. I have to think so. I mean. I know what you mean. Wisdom paced back and forth, among the study tables, technicians at their benches, equipment and humming computers. Buzzing tape slots and research hookups. This thing lived 18 years with his family and they don't understand it. They don't know what it has. They know what it does, but not how. What does it do? It knows things. What kind of things? Wisdom grabbed his lash tube from his belt and tossed it on a table. Here. What? Here. Wisdom signaled, and a view window was slid back an inch. Shoot him. Baines blinked. You said 48 hours. With a curse, Wisdom snatched up the tube, aimed it through the window directly at the seated figure's back, and squeezed the trigger. A blinding flash of pink. A cloud of energy blossomed in the center of the chamber. It sparkled, then died into dark ash. Good God! Baines gasped. You! He broke off. The figure was no longer sitting. As Wisdom fired, it had moved in a blur of speed, away from the blast, to the corner of the chamber. Now it was slowly coming back, face blank, still absorbed in thought. Fifth time, Wisdom said, as he put his tube away. Last time Jameson and I fired together. Missed. He knew exactly when the bolts would hit. And where. Baines and Wisdom looked at each other. Both of them were thinking the same thing. But even reading minds wouldn't tell him where they were going to hit, Baines said. When, maybe. But not where. Could you have called your own shots? Not mine, Wisdom answered flatly. I fired fast, damn near at random. He frowned. Random. We'll have to make a test of this. He waved a group of technicians over. Get a construction team up here. On the double. He grabbed paper and pen and began sketching. While construction was going on, Baines met his fiancée in the lobby outside the lab, the great central lounge of the DCA building. How's it coming? She asked. Anita Ferris was tall and blonde, blue eyes and a mature, carefully cultivated figure. An attractive, competent-looking woman in her late 20s. She wore a metal foil dress and cape with a red and black stripe on the sleeve, the emblem of the A-class. Anita was director of the Semantics Agency, a top-level government coordinator. Anything of interest, this time? Plenty. Baines guided her from the lobby, into the dim recess of the bar. Music played softly in the background, a shifting variety of patterns formed mathematically. Dim shapes moved expertly through the gloom, from table to table. Silent, efficient robot waiters. As Anita sipped her Tom Collins, Baines outlined what they had found. What are the chances, Anita asked slowly, that he's built up some kind of deflection cone? There was one kind that warped their environment by direct mental effort. No tools. Direct mind to matter. Psychokinetics. Baines drummed restlessly on the tabletop. I doubt it. The thing has ability to predict, not to control. He can't stop the beams, but he can sure as hell get out of the way. Does he jump between the molecules? Baines wasn't amused. This is serious. We've handled these things 60 years, longer than you and I have been around added together. 87 types of deviants have shown up, real mutants that could reproduce themselves, not mere freaks. This is the 88th. We've been able to handle each of them in turn. But this. Why are you so worried about this one? First, it's 18 years old. That in itself is incredible. Its family managed to hide it that long. Those women around Denver were older than that. Those ones with. They were in a government camp. Somebody high up was toying with the idea of allowing them to breed. Some sort of industrial use. We withheld youth for years. But Chris Johnson stayed alive outside our control. Those things at Denver were under constant scrutiny. Maybe he's harmless. You always assume a div is a menace. He might even be beneficial. Somebody thought those women might work in. Maybe this thing has something that would advance the race. Which race? Not the human race. It's the old, the operation was a success but the patient died routine. If we introduce a mutant to keep us going, it'll be mutants, not us, who'll inherit the earth. It'll be mutants surviving for their own sake. Don't think for a moment we can put padlocks on them and expect them to serve us. If they're really superior to Homo sapiens, they'll win out in even competition. To survive, we've got to cold deck them right from the start. In other words, we'll know Homo superior when he comes, by definition. He'll be the one we won't be able to youth. That's about it, Baines answered. Assuming there is a Homo superior. Maybe there's just Homo peculiar. Homo with an improved line. The Neanderthal probably thought the Cro-Magnon man had merely an improved line. A little more advanced ability to conjure up symbols and shape flint. From your description, this thing is more radical than a mere improvement. This thing, Baines said slowly, has an ability to predict. So far, it's been able to stay alive. It's been able to cope with situations better than you or I could. How long do you think we'd stay alive in that chamber, with energy beams blazing down at us? In a sense, it's got the ultimate survival ability. If it can always be accurate. A wall speaker sounded. Baines, you're wanted in the lab. Get the hell out of the bar and up-ramp. Baines pushed back his chair and got to his feet. Come along. You may be interested in seeing what Wisdom has got dreamed up. A tight group of top-level DCA officials stood around in a circle, middle-aged, gray-haired. Listening to a skinny youth in a white shirt and rolled-up sleeves explaining an elaborate cube of metal and plastic that filled the center of the view platform. From it jutted an ugly array of tube snouts, gleaming muzzles that disappeared into an intricate maze of wiring. This, the youth was saying briskly, is the first real test. It fires at random, as nearly random as we can make it, at least. Weighted balls are thrown up in an airstream, then dropped free to fall back and cut relays. They can fall in almost any pattern. The thing fires according to their pattern. Each drop produces a new configuration of timing and position. 10 tubes, in all. Each will be in constant motion. And nobody knows how they'll fire. Anita asked. Nobody. Wisdom rubbed his thick hands together. Mind reading won't help him, not with this thing. Anita moved over to the view windows, as the cube was rolled into place. She gasped. Is that him? What's wrong? Baines asked. Anita's cheeks were flushed. Why, I expected a thing. My God, he's beautiful. Like a golden statue. Like a deity. Baines laughed. He's 18 years old, Anita. Too young for you. The woman was still peering through the view window. Look at him. 18. I don't believe it. Chris Johnson sat in the center of the chamber, on the floor. A posture of contemplation, head bowed, arms folded, legs tucked under him. In the stark glare of the overhead lights his powerful body glowed and rippled, a shimmering figure of downy gold. Pretty, isn't he? Wisdom muttered. All right. Start it going. You're going to kill him? Anita demanded. We're going to try. But she broke off uncertainly. He's not a monster. He's not like those others, those hideous things with 2 heads, or those insects. Or those awful things from Tunis. What is he, then? Baines asked. I don't know. But you can't just kill him. It's terrible. The cube clicked into life. The muzzles jerked, silently altered position. 3 retracted, disappeared into the body of the cube. Others came out. Quickly, efficiently, they moved into position, and abruptly, without warning, opened fire. A staggering burst of energy fanned out, a complex pattern that altered each moment, different angles, different velocities, a bewildering blur that cracked from the windows down into the chamber. The golden figure moved. He dodged back and forth, expertly avoiding the bursts of energy that seared around him on all sides. Rolling clouds of ash obscured him, he was lost in a mist of crackling fire and ash. "Stop it!" Anita shouted. "For God's sake, you'll destroy him." The chamber was an inferno of energy. The figure had completely disappeared. Wisdom waited a moment, then nodded to the technicians operating the cube. They touched guide buttons and the muzzles slowed and died. Some sank back into the cube. All became silent. The works of the cube ceased humming. Chris Johnson was still alive. He emerged from the settling clouds of ash, blackened and singed. But unhurt. He had avoided each beam. He had weaved between them and among them as they came, a dancer leaping over glittering sword points of pink fire. He had survived. "No," Wisdom murmured, shaken and grim. "Not a telepath. Those were at random. No prearranged pattern." The three of them looked at each other, dazed and frightened. Anita was trembling. Her face was pale and her blue eyes were wide. "What, then?" she whispered. "What is it? What does he have?" "He's a good guesser," Wisdom suggested. "He's not guessing," Baines answered. "Don't kid yourself. That's the whole point." "No, he's not guessing." Wisdom nodded slowly. "He knew. He predicted each strike. I wonder. Can he err? Can he make a mistake?" "We caught him," Baines pointed out. "You said he came back voluntarily." There was a strange look on Wisdom's face. "Did he come back after the clamp was up?" Baines jumped. "Yes, after. He couldn't have got through the clamp. So he came back." Wisdom grinned wryly. "The clamp must actually have been perfect. It was supposed to be. If there had been a single hole," Baines murmured, "he would have known it, gone through." Wisdom ordered a group of armed guards over. "Get him out of there. To the youth stage." Anita shrieked. "Wisdom, you can't. He's too far ahead of us. We can't compete with him." Wisdom's eyes were bleak. "We can only guess what's going to happen. He knows. For him, it's a sure thing. I don't think it'll help him at youth, though. The whole stage is flooded simultaneously. Instantaneous gas, released throughout." He signaled impatiently to the guards. "Get going. Take him down right away. Don't waste any time." "Can we?" Baines murmured thoughtfully. The guards took up positions by one of the chamber locks. Cautiously, the tower control slid the lock back. The first two guards stepped cautiously in, lash tubes ready. Chris stood in the center of the chamber. His back was to them as they crept toward him. For a moment he was silent, utterly unmoving. The guards fanned out, as more of them entered the chamber. Then Anita screamed. Wisdom cursed. The golden figure spun and leaped forward, in a flashing blur of speed. Past the triple line of guards, through the lock and into the corridor. "Get him!" Baines shouted. Guards milled everywhere. Flashes of energy lit up the corridor, as the figure raced among them up the ramp. "No use," Wisdom said calmly. "We can't hit him." He touched a button, then another. "But maybe this will help." "What?" Baines began. But the leaping figure shot abruptly at him, straight at him, and he dropped to one side. The figure flashed past. It ran effortlessly, face without expression, dodging and jumping as the energy beams seared around it. For an instant the golden face loomed up before Baines. It passed and disappeared down a side corridor. Guards rushed after it, kneeling and firing, shouting orders excitedly. In the bowels of the building, heavy guns were rumbling up. Locks slid into place as escape corridors were systematically sealed off. "Good God," Baines gasped, as he got to his feet. "Can't he do anything but run?" "I gave orders," Wisdom said, "to have the building isolated. There's no way out." Nobody comes and nobody goes. He's loose here in the building, but he won't get out. If there's one exit overlooked, he'll know it, Anita pointed out shakily. We won't overlook any exit. We got him once, we'll get him again. A messenger robot had come in. Now it presented its message respectfully to Wisdom. From analysis, sir. Wisdom tore the tape open. Now we'll know how it thinks. His hands were shaking. Maybe we can figure out its blind spot. It may be able to outthink us, but that doesn't mean it's invulnerable. It only predicts the future, it can't change it. If there's only death ahead, its ability won't. Wisdom's voice faded into silence. After a moment he passed the tape to Baines. I'll be down in the bar, Wisdom said. Getting a good stiff drink. His face had turned lead gray. All I can say is I hope to hell this isn't the race to come. What's the analysis? Anita demanded impatiently, peering over Baines' shoulder. How does it think? It doesn't, Baines said, as he handed the tape back to his boss. It doesn't think at all. Virtually no frontal lobe. It's not a human being, it doesn't use symbols. It's nothing but an animal. An animal, Wisdom said. With a single highly developed faculty. Not a superior man. Not a man at all. Up and down the corridors of the DCA building, guards and equipment clanged. Loads of civil police were pouring into the building and taking up positions beside the guards. One by one, the corridors and rooms were being inspected and sealed off. Sooner or later the golden figure of Chris Johnson would be located and cornered. We were always afraid a mutant with superior intellectual powers would come along, Baines said reflectively. A div who would be to us what we are to the great apes. Something with a bulging cranium, telepathic ability, a perfect semantic system, ultimate powers of symbolization and calculation. A development along our own path. A better human being. He acts by reflex, Anita said wonderingly. She had the analysis and was sitting at one of the desks studying it intently. Reflex, like a lion. A golden lion. She pushed the tape aside, a strange expression on her face. The lion god. Beast, Wisdom corrected tartly. Blonde beast, you mean. He runs fast, Baines said, and that's all. No tools. He doesn't build anything or utilize anything outside himself. He just stands and waits for the right opportunity and then he runs like hell. This is worse than anything we've anticipated, Wisdom said. His beefy face was lead gray. He sagged like an old man, his blunt hands trembling and uncertain. To be replaced by an animal. Something that runs and hides. Something without a language. He spat savagely. That's why they weren't able to communicate with it. We wondered what kind of semantic system it had. It hasn't got any. No more ability to talk and think than a dog. That means intelligence has failed, Baines went on huskily. We're the last of our line, like the dinosaur. We've carried intelligence as far as it'll go. Too far, maybe. We've already got to the point where we know so much, think so much, we can't act. Men of thought, Anita said. Not men of action. It's begun to have a paralyzing effect. But this thing's faculty works better than ours ever did. We can recall past experiences, keep them in mind, learn from them. At best, we can make shrewd guesses about the future, from our memory of what's happened in the past. But we can't be certain. We have to speak of probabilities. Grays. Not blacks and whites. We're only guessing. Chris Johnson isn't guessing, Anita added. He can look ahead. See what's coming. He can, pre-think. Let's call it that. He can see into the future. Probably he doesn't perceive it as the future. No, Anita said thoughtfully. It would seem like the present. He has a broader present. But his present lies ahead, not back. Our present is related to the past. Only the past is certain, to us. To him, the future is certain. And he probably doesn't remember the past, any more than any animal remembers what happened. As he develops, Baines said, as his race evolves, it'll probably expand its ability to pre-think. Instead of 10 minutes, 30 minutes. Then an hour. A day. A year. Eventually they'll be able to keep ahead a whole lifetime. Each one of them will live in a solid, unchanging world. There'll be no variables, no uncertainty. No motion. They won't have anything to fear. Their world will be perfectly static, a solid block of matter. And when death comes, Anita said, they'll accept it. There won't be any struggle, to them, it'll already have happened. Already have happened, Baines repeated. To Chris, our shots had already been fired. He laughed harshly. Superior survival doesn't mean superior man. If there were another worldwide flood, only fish would survive. If there were another ice age, maybe nothing but polar bears would be left. When we opened the lock, he had already seen the men, seen exactly where they were standing and what they'd do. A neat faculty, but not a development of mind. A pure physical sense. But if every exit is covered, Wisdom repeated, he'll see he can't get out. He gave himself up before, he'll give himself up again. He shook his head. An animal. Without language. Without tools. With his new sense, Baines said, he doesn't need anything else. He examined his watch. It's after 2. Is the building completely sealed off? You can't leave, Wisdom stated. You'll have to stay here all night, or until we catch the bastard. I meant her. Baines indicated Anita. She's supposed to be back at Semantics by 7 in the morning. Wisdom shrugged. I have no control over her. If she wants, she can check out. I'll stay, Anita decided. I want to be here when he's destroyed. I'll sleep here. She hesitated. Wisdom, isn't there some other way? If he's just an animal, couldn't we? A zoo? Wisdom's voice rose in a frenzy of hysteria. Keep it penned up in the zoo? Christ, no. It's got to be killed. For a long time the great gleaming shape crouched in the darkness. He was in a storeroom. Boxes and cartons stretched out on all sides, heaped up in orderly rows, all neatly counted and marked. Silent and deserted. But in a few moments people burst in and searched the room. He could see this. He saw them in all parts of the room, clear and distinct, men with lash tubes, grim-faced, stalking with murder in their eyes. The sight was one of many. One of a multitude of clearly etched scenes lying tangent to his own. And to each was attached a further multitude of interlocking scenes, that finally grew hazier and dwindled away. A progressive vagueness, each syndrome less distinct. But the immediate one, the scene that lay closest to him, was clearly visible. He could easily make out the sight of the armed men. Therefore it was necessary to be out of the room before they appeared. The golden figure got calmly to its feet and moved to the door. The corridor was empty. He could see himself already outside, in the vacant, drumming hall of metal and recessed lights. He pushed the door boldly open and stepped out. A lift blinked across the hall. He walked to the lift and entered it. In 5 minutes a group of guards would come running along and leap into the lift. By that time he would have left it and sent it back down. Now he pressed a button and rose to the next floor. He stepped out into a deserted passage. No one was in sight. That didn't surprise him. He couldn't be surprised. The element didn't exist for him. The positions of things, the space relationships of all matter in the immediate future, were as certain for him as his own body. The only thing that was unknown was that which had already passed out of being. In a vague, dim fashion, he had occasionally wondered where things went after he had passed them. He came to a small supply closet. It had just been searched. It would be a half an hour before anyone opened it again. He had that long, he could see that far ahead. And then he would be able to see another area, a region farther beyond. He was always moving, advancing into new regions he had never seen before. A constantly unfolding panorama of sights and scenes, frozen landscapes spread out ahead. All objects were fixed. Pieces on a vast chessboard through which he moved, arms folded, face calm. A detached observer who saw objects that lay ahead of him as clearly as those underfoot. Right now, as he crouched in the small supply closet, he saw an unusually varied multitude of scenes for the next half hour. Much lay ahead. The half hour was divided into an incredibly complex pattern of separate configurations. He had reached a critical region, he was about to move through worlds of intricate complexity. He concentrated on a scene 10 minutes away. It showed, like a three-dimensional still, a heavy gun at the end of the corridor, trained all the way to the far end. Men moved cautiously from door to door, checking each room again, as they had done repeatedly. At the end of the half hour they had reached the supply closet. A scene showed them looking inside. By that time he was gone, of course. He wasn't in that scene. He had passed on to another. The next scene showed an exit. Guards stood in a solid line. No way out. He was in that scene. Off to one side, in a niche just inside the door. The street outside was visible, stars, lights, outlines of passing cars and people. In the next tableau he had gone back, away from the exit. There was no way out. In another tableau he saw himself at other exits, a legion of golden figures, duplicated again and again, as he explored regions ahead, one after another. But each exit was covered. In one dim scene he saw himself lying charred and dead, he had tried to run through the line, out the exit. But that scene was vague. One wavering, indistinct still out of many. The inflexible path along which he moved would not deviate in that direction. It would not turn him that way. The golden figure in that scene, the miniature doll in that room, was only distantly related to him. It was himself, but a faraway self. A self he would never meet. He forgot it and went on to examine the other tableau. The myriad of tableaus that surrounded him were an elaborate maze, a web which he now considered bit by bit. He was looking down into a doll's house of infinite rooms, rooms without number, each with its furniture, its dolls, all rigid and unmoving. The same dolls and furniture were repeated in many. He, himself, appeared often. The two men on the platform. The woman. Again and again the same combinations turned up, the play was redone frequently, the same actors and props moved around in all possible ways. Before it was time to leave the supply closet, Chris Johnson had examined each of the rooms tangent to the one he now occupied. He had consulted each, considered its contents thoroughly. He pushed the door open and stepped calmly out into the hall. He knew exactly where he was going. And what he had to do. Crouched in the stuffy closet, he had quietly and expertly examined each miniature of himself, observed which clearly etched configuration lay along his inflexible path, the one room of the doll house, the one set out of legions, toward which he was moving. Anita slipped out of her metal foil dress, hung it over a hanger, then unfastened her shoes and kicked them under the bed. She was just starting to unclip her bra when the door opened. She gasped. Soundlessly, calmly, the great golden shape closed the door and bolted it after him. Anita snatched up her lash tube from the dressing table. Her hands shook, her whole body was trembling. "What do you want?" she demanded. Her fingers tightened convulsively around the tube. "I'll kill you." The figure regarded her silently, arms folded. It was the first time she had seen Chris Johnson closely. The great dignified face, handsome and impassive. Broad shoulders. The golden mane of hair, golden skin, pelt of radiant fuzz. "Why?" she demanded breathlessly. Her heart was pounding wildly. What do you want? She could kill him easily. But the lash tube wavered. Chris Johnson stood without fear. He wasn't at all afraid. Why not? Didn't he understand what it was? What the small metal tube could do to him? Of course, she said suddenly, in a choked whisper. You can see ahead. You know I'm not going to kill you. Or you wouldn't have come here. She flushed, terrified, and embarrassed. He knew exactly what she was going to do. He could see it as easily as she saw the walls of the room, the wall bed with its covers folded neatly back, her clothes hanging in the closet, her purse and small things on the dressing table. All right. Anita backed away, then abruptly put the tube down on the dressing table. I won't kill you. Why should I? She fumbled in her purse and got out her cigarettes. Shakily, she lit up, her pulse racing. She was scared. And strangely fascinated. Do you expect to stay here? It won't do any good. They've come through the dorm twice, already. They'll be back. Could he understand her? She saw nothing on his face, only blank dignity. God, he was huge. It wasn't possible he was only 18, a boy, a child. He looked more like some great golden god, come down to earth. She shook the thought off savagely. He wasn't a god. He was a beast. The blonde beast, come to take the place of man. To drive man from the earth. Anita snatched up the lash tube. Get out of here. You're an animal. A big stupid animal. You can't even understand what I'm saying, you don't even have a language. You're not human. Chris Johnson remained silent. As if he were waiting. Waiting for what? He showed no sign of fear or impatience, even though the corridor outside rang with the sound of men searching, metal against metal, guns and energy tubes being dragged around. Shouts and dim rumbles as section after section of the building was searched and sealed off. They'll get you, Anita said. You'll be trapped here. They'll be searching this wing any moment. She savagely stubbed out her cigarette. For God's sake, what do you expect me to do? Chris moved toward her. Anita shrank back. His powerful hands caught hold of her and she gasped in sudden terror. For a moment she struggled blindly, desperately. Let go. She broke away and leaped back from him. His face was expressionless. Calmly, he came toward her, an impassive god advancing to take her. Get away. She groped for the lash tube, trying to get up. But the tube slipped from her fingers and rolled onto the floor. Chris bent down and picked it up. He held it out to her, in the open palm of his hand. Good God, Anita whispered. Shakily, she accepted the tube, gripped it hesitantly, then put it down again on the dressing table. In the half-light of the room, the great golden figure seemed to glow and shimmer, outlined against the darkness. A god, no, not a god. An animal. A great golden beast, without a soul. She was confused. Which was he, or was he both? She shook her head, bewildered. It was late, almost 4. She was exhausted and confused. Chris took her in his arms. Gently, kindly, he lifted her face and kissed her. His powerful hands held her tight. She couldn't breathe. Darkness, mixed with the shimmering golden haze, swept around her. Around and around it spiraled, carrying her senses away. She sank down into it gratefully. The darkness covered her and dissolved her in a swelling torrent of sheer force that mounted in intensity each moment, until the roar of it beat against her and at last blotted out everything. Anita blinked. She sat up and automatically pushed her hair into place. Chris was standing before the closet. He was reaching up, getting something down. He turned toward her and tossed something on the bed. Her heavy metal foil traveling cape. Anita gazed down at the cape without comprehension. What do you want? Chris stood by the bed, waiting. She picked up the cape uncertainly. Cold creepers of fear plucked at her. "You want me to get you out of here," she said softly. "Past the guards and the CP." Chris said nothing. "They'll kill you instantly." She got unsteadily to her feet. "You can't run past them." "Good God, don't you do anything but run?" "There must be a better way. Maybe I can appeal to wisdom. I'm Class A, Director Class. I can go directly to the full directorate. I ought to be able to hold them off, keep back the youth indefinitely. The odds are 1,000,000,000 against us if we try to break past." She broke off. "But you don't gamble," she continued slowly. "You don't go by odds. You know what's coming. You've seen the cards already." She studied his face intently. "No, you can't be cold-decked. It wouldn't be possible." For a moment she stood deep in thought. Then with a quick, decisive motion, she snatched up the cloak and slipped it around her bare shoulders. She fastened the heavy belt, bent down and got her shoes from under the bed, snatched up her purse, and hurried to the door. "Come on," she said. She was breathing quickly, cheeks flushed. "Let's go. While there are still a number of exits to choose from. My car is parked outside, in the lot at the side of the building. We can get to my place in an hour. I have a winter home in Argentina. If worse comes to worst we can fly there. It's in the back country, away from the cities. Jungle and swamps. Cut off from almost everything." Eagerly she started to open the door. Chris reached out and stopped her. Gently, patiently, he moved in front of her. He waited a long time, body rigid. Then he turned the knob and stepped boldly out into the corridor. The corridor was empty. No one was in sight. Anita caught a faint glimpse, the back of a guard hurrying off. If they had come out a second earlier. Chris started down the corridor. She ran after him. He moved rapidly, effortlessly. The girl had trouble keeping up with him. He seemed to know exactly where to go. Off to the right, down a side hall, a supply passage. Onto an ascent freight lift. They rose, then abruptly halted. Chris waited again. Presently he slid the door back and moved out of the lift. Anita followed nervously. She could hear sounds, guns and men, very close. They were near an exit. A double line of guards stood directly ahead. 20 men, a solid wall, and a massive heavy-duty robot gun in the center. The men were alert, faces strained and tense. Watching wide-eyed, guns gripped tight. A civil police officer was in charge. "We'll never get past," Anita gasped. "We wouldn't get 10 feet. She pulled back. "They'll." Chris took her by the arm and continued calmly forward. Blind terror leaped inside her. She fought wildly to get away, but his fingers were like steel. She couldn't pry them loose. Quietly, irresistibly, the great golden creature drew her along beside him toward the double line of guards. "There he is." Guns went up. Men leaped into action. The barrel of the robot cannon swung around. "Get him." Anita was paralyzed. She sagged against the powerful body beside her, tugged along helplessly by his inflexible grasp. The lines of guards came nearer, a sheer wall of guns. Anita fought to control her terror. She stumbled, half fell. Chris supported her effortlessly. She scratched, fought at him, struggled to get loose. "Don't shoot," she screamed. Guns wavered uncertainly. "Who is she?" The guards were moving around, trying to get a sight on Chris without including her. "Who's he got there?" One of them saw the stripe on her sleeve. "Red and black. Director class. Top level. She's Class A." Shocked, the guards retreated. "Miss, get out of the way." Anita found her voice. "Don't shoot. He's in my custody. You understand? I'm taking him out." The wall of guards moved back nervously. No one's supposed to pass. Director Wisdom gave orders. I'm not subject to Wisdom's authority. She managed to edge her voice with a harsh crispness. Get out of the way. I'm taking him to the semantics agency. For a moment nothing happened. There was no reaction. Then slowly, uncertainly, one guard stepped aside. Chris moved. A blur of speed, away from Anita, past the confused guards, through the breach in the line, out the exit and onto the street. Bursts of energy flashed wildly after him. Shouting guards milled out. Anita was left behind, forgotten. The guards, the heavy-duty gun, were pouring out into the early morning darkness. Sirens wailed. Patrol cars roared into life. Anita stood dazed, confused, leaning against the wall, trying to get her breath. He was gone. He had left her. Good God, what had she done? She shook her head, bewildered, her face buried in her hands. She had been hypnotized. She had lost her will, her common sense. Her reason. The animal, the great golden beast, had tricked her. Taken advantage of her. And now he was gone, escaped into the night. Miserable, agonized tears trickled through her clenched fingers. She rubbed at them futilely, but they kept on coming. He's gone, Baines said. We'll never get him, now. He's probably 1,000,000 miles from here. Anita sat huddled in the corner, her face to the wall. A little bent heap, broken and wretched. Wisdom paced back and forth. But where can he go? Where can he hide? Nobody'll hide him. Everybody knows the law about thieves. He's lived out in the woods most of his life. He'll hunt, that's what he's always done. They wondered what he was up to, off by himself. He was catching game and sleeping under trees. Baines laughed harshly. And the first woman he meets will be glad to hide him, as she was. He indicated Anita with a jerk of his thumb. So all that gold, that mane, that godlike stance, was for something. Not just ornament. Wisdom's thick lips twisted. He doesn't have just one faculty, he has two. One is new, the newest thing in survival method. The other is old as life. He stopped pacing to glare at the huddled shape in the corner. Plumage. Bright feathers, combs for the rooster, swans, birds, bright scales for the fish. Gleaming pelts and manes for the animals. An animal isn't necessarily bestial. Lions aren't bestial. Or tigers. Or any of the big cats. They're anything but bestial. He'll never have to worry, Baines said. He'll get by, as long as human women exist to take care of him. And since he can see ahead, into the future, he already knows he's sexually irresistible to human females. We'll get him, Wisdom muttered. I've had the government declare an emergency. Military and civil police will be looking for him. Armies of men, a whole planet of experts, the most advanced machines and equipment. We'll flush him, sooner or later. By that time it won't make any difference, Baines said. He put his hand on Anita's shoulder and patted her ironically. You'll have company, sweetheart. You won't be the only one. You're just the first of a long procession. Thanks, Anita grated. The oldest survival method and the newest. Combined to form one perfectly adapted animal. How the hell are we going to stop him? We can put you through a sterilization tank, but we can't pick them all up, all the women he meets along the way. And if we miss one we're finished. We'll have to keep trying, Wisdom said. Round up as many as we can. Before they can spawn. Faint hope glinted in his tired, sagging face. Maybe his characteristics are recessive. Maybe ours will cancel his out. I wouldn't lay any money on that, Baines said. I think I know already which of the two strains is going to turn up dominant. He grinned wryly. I mean, I'm making a good guess. It won't be us. Of Withered Apples. Something was tapping on the window. Blowing up against the pane, again and again. Carried by the wind. Tapping faintly, insistently. Laurie, sitting on the couch, pretended not to hear. She gripped her book tightly and turned a page. The tapping came again, louder and more imperative. It could not be ignored. Darn! Laurie said, throwing her book down on the coffee table and hurrying to the window. She grasped the heavy brass handles and lifted. For a moment the window resisted. Then, with a protesting groan, it reluctantly rose. Cold autumn air rushed into the room. The bit of leaf ceased tapping and swirled against the woman's throat, dancing to the floor. Laurie picked the leaf up. It was old and brown. Her heart skipped a beat as she slipped the leaf into the pocket of her jeans. Against her loins the leaf cut and tingled, a little hard point piercing her smooth skin and sending exciting shudders up and down her spine. She stood at the open window a moment, sniffing the air. The air was full of the presence of trees and rocks, of great boulders and remote places. It was time to go again. She touched the leaf. She was wanted. Quickly Laurie left the big living room, hurrying through the hall into the dining room. The dining room was empty. A few chords of laughter drifted from the kitchen. Laurie pushed the kitchen door open. Steve. Her husband and his father were sitting around the kitchen table, smoking their cigars and drinking steaming black coffee. What is it? Steve demanded, frowning at his young wife. Ed and I are in the middle of business. I want to ask you something. The two men gazed at her, brown-haired Stephen, his dark eyes full of the stubborn dignity of New England men, and his father, silent and withdrawn in her presence. Ed Patterson scarcely noticed her. He rustled through a sheaf of feed bills, his broad back turned toward her. What is it? Steve demanded impatiently. What do you want? Can't it wait? I have to go, Laurie blurted. Go where? Outside. Anxiety flooded over her. This is the last time. I promise. I won't go again, after this. Okay. She tried to smile, but her heart was pounding too hard. Please let me, Steve. Where does she go? Ed rumbled. Steve grunted in annoyance. Up in the hills. Some old abandoned place up there. Ed's gray eyes flickered. Abandoned farm? Yes. You know it. The old Rickley farm. Rickley moved away years ago. Couldn't get anything to grow, not up there. Ground's all rocks. Bad soil. A lot of clay and stones. The place is all overgrown, tumbled down. What kind of farm was it? Orchard. Fruit orchard. Never yielded a damn thing. Thin old trees. Waste of effort. Steve looked at his pocket watch. You'll be back in time to fix dinner. Yes. Laurie moved toward the door. Then I can go. Steve's face twisted as he made up his mind. Laurie waited impatiently, scarcely breathing. She had never got used to Vermont men and their slow, deliberate way. Boston people were quite different. And her group had been more the college youths, dances and talk, and late laughter. Why do you go up there? Steve grumbled. Don't ask me, Steve. Just let me go. This is the last time. She writhed in agony. She clenched her fists. Please. Steve looked out the window. The cold autumn wind swirled through the trees. All right. But it's going to snow. I don't see why you want to. Laurie ran to get her coat from the closet. I'll be back to fix dinner, she shouted joyfully. She hurried to the front porch buttoning her coat, her heart racing. Her cheeks were flushed a deep, excited red as she closed the door behind her, her blood pounding in her veins. Cold wind whipped against her, rumpling her hair, plucking at her body. She took a deep breath of the wind and started down the steps. She walked rapidly onto the field, toward the bleak line of hills beyond. Except for the wind there was no sound. She patted her pocket. The dry leaf broke and dug hungrily into her. "I'm coming," she whispered, a little awed and frightened. "I'm on my way." Higher and higher the woman climbed. She passed through a deep cleft between two rocky ridges. Huge roots from old stumps spurted out on all sides. She followed a dried-up creek bed, winding and turning. After a time low mists began to blow about her. At the top of the ridge she halted, breathing deeply, looking back the way she had come. A few drops of rain stirred the leaves around her. Again the wind moved through the great dead trees along the ridge. Laurie turned and started on, her head down, hands in her coat pockets. She was on a rocky field, overgrown with weeds and dead grass. After a time she came to a ruined fence, broken and rotting. She stepped over it. She passed a tumble-down well, half filled with stones and earth. Her heart beat quickly, fluttering with nervous excitement. She was almost there. She passed the remains of a building, sagging timbers and broken glass, a few ruined pieces of furniture strewn nearby. An old automobile tire caked and cracked. Some damp rags heaped over rusty, bent bed springs. And there it was, directly ahead. Along the edge of the field was a grove of ancient trees. Lifeless trees, withered and dead, their thin, blackened stalks rising up leaflessly. Broken sticks stuck in the hard ground. Row after row of dead trees, some bent and leaning, torn loose from the rocky soil by the unending wind. Laurie crossed the field to the trees, her lungs laboring painfully. The wind surged against her without respite, whipping the foul-smelling mists into her nostrils and face. Her smooth skin was damp and shiny with the mist. She coughed and hurried on, stepping over the rocks and clods of earth, trembling with fear and anticipation. She circled around the grove of trees, almost to the edge of the ridge. Carefully, she stepped among the sliding heaps of rocks. Then she stopped, rigid. Her chest rose and fell with the effort of breathing. "I came," she gasped. For a long time she gazed at the withered old apple tree. She could not take her eyes from it. The sight of the ancient tree fascinated and repelled her. It was the only one alive, the only tree of all the grove still living. All the others were dead, dried up. They had lost the struggle. But this tree still clung to life. The tree was hard and barren. Only a few dark leaves hung from it, and some withered apples, dried and seasoned by wind and mists. They had stayed there, on the branches, forgotten and abandoned. The ground around the tree was cracked and bleak. Stones and decayed heaps of old leaves in ragged clumps. "I came," Laurie said again. She took the leaf from her pocket and held it cautiously out. This tapped at the window. "I knew when I heard it." She smiled mischievously, her red lips curling. It tapped and tapped, trying to get in. I ignored it. It was so impetuous. It annoyed me. The tree swayed ominously. Its gnarled branches rubbed together. Something in the sound made Laurie pull away. Terror rushed through her. She hurried back along the ridge, scrambling frantically out of reach. "Don't," she whispered. "Please." The wind ceased. The tree became silent. For a long time Laurie watched it apprehensively. Night was coming. The sky was darkening rapidly. A burst of frigid wind struck her, half turning her around. She shuddered, bracing herself against it, pulling her long coat around her. Far below, the floor of the valley was disappearing into shadow, into the vast cloud of night. In the darkening mists the tree was stern and menacing, more ominous than usual. A few leaves blew from it, drifting and swirling with the wind. A leaf blew past her and she tried to catch it. The leaf escaped, dancing back toward the tree. Laurie followed a little way and then stopped, gasping and laughing. "No," she said firmly, her hands on her hips. "I won't." There was silence. Suddenly the heaps of decayed leaves blew up in a furious circle around the tree. They quieted down, settling back. "No," Laurie said. "I'm not afraid of you. You can't hurt me." But her heart was hammering with fear. She moved back farther away. The tree remained silent. Its wiry branches were motionless. Laurie regained her courage. "This is the last time I can come," she said. "Steve says I can't come anymore. He doesn't like it." She waited, but the tree did not respond. "They're sitting in the kitchen. The two of them. Smoking cigars and drinking coffee. Adding up feed bills." She wrinkled her nose. "That's all they ever do. Add and subtract feed bills. Figure and figure. Profit and loss. Government taxes. Depreciation on the equipment." The tree did not stir. Laurie shivered. A little more rain fell, big icy drops that slid down her cheeks, down the back of her neck and inside her heavy coat. She moved closer to the tree. "I won't be back. I won't see you again. This is the last time. I wanted to tell you." The tree moved. Its branches whipped into sudden life. Laurie felt something hard and thin cut across her shoulder. Something caught her around the waist, tugging her forward. She struggled desperately, trying to pull herself free. Suddenly the tree released her. She stumbled back, laughing and trembling with fear. "No," she gasped. "You can't have me." She hurried to the edge of the ridge. "You'll never get me again. Understand? And I'm not afraid of you." She stood, waiting and watching, trembling with cold and fear. Suddenly she turned and fled, down the side of the ridge, sliding and falling on the loose stones. Blind terror gripped her. She ran on, down the steep slope, grabbing at roots and weeds. Something rolled beside her shoe. Something small and hard. She bent down and picked it up. It was a little dried apple. Laurie gazed back up the slope at the tree. The tree was almost lost in the swirling mists. It stood, jutting up against the black sky, a hard unmoving pillar. Laurie put the apple in her coat pocket and continued down the side of the hill. When she reached the floor of the valley she took the apple out of her pocket. It was late. A deep hunger began to gnaw inside her. She thought suddenly of dinner, the warm kitchen, the white tablecloth. Steaming stew and biscuits. As she walked she nibbled on the little apple. Laurie sat up in bed, the covers falling away from her. The house was dark and silent. A few night noises sounded faintly, far off. It was past midnight. Beside her Stephen slept quietly, turned over on his side. What had wakened her? Laurie pushed her dark hair back out of her eyes, shaking her head. What? A spasm of pain burst loose inside her. She gasped and put her hand to her stomach. For a time she wrestled silently, jaws locked, swaying back and forth. The pain went away. Laurie sank back. She cried out, a faint, thin cry. "Steve!" Stephen stirred. He turned over a little, grunting in his sleep. The pain came again. Harder. She fell forward on her face, writhing in agony. The pain ripped at her, tearing at her belly. She screamed, a shrill wail of fear and pain. Steve sat up. For God's sake, he rubbed his eyes and snapped on the lamp. What the hell? Laurie lay on her side, gasping and moaning, her eyes staring, knotted fists pressed into her stomach. The pain twisted and seared, devouring her, eating into her. Laurie! Stephen grated. What is it? She screamed. Again and again. Until the house rocked with echoes. She slid from the bed, onto the floor, her body writhing and jerking, her face unrecognizable. Ed came hurrying into the room, pulling his bathrobe around him. "What's going on?" The two men stared helplessly down at the woman on the floor. "Good God," Ed said. He closed his eyes. The day was cold and dark. Snow fell silently over the streets and houses, over the red brick county hospital building. Dr. Blair walked slowly up the gravel path to his Ford car. He slid inside and turned the ignition key. The motor leaped alive, and he let the brake out. "I'll call you later," Dr. Blair said. "There are certain particulars." "I know," Steve muttered. He was still dazed. His face was gray and puffy from lack of sleep. "I left some sedatives for you. Try to get a little rest." "You think," Steve asked suddenly, "if we had called you earlier?" "No." Blair glanced up at him sympathetically. "I don't. In a thing like that, there's not much chance. Not after it's burst." "Then it was appendicitis?" Blair nodded. "Yes. If we hadn't been so damn far out," Steve said bitterly. "Stuck out in the country. No hospital. Nothing. Miles from town. And we didn't realize at first. Well, it's over now." The upright Ford moved forward a little. All at once a thought came to the doctor. "One more thing." "What is it?" Steve said dully. Blair hesitated. "Post-mortems, very unfortunate. I don't think there's any reason for one in this case. I'm certain in my own mind. But I wanted to ask." "What is it? Is there anything the girl might have swallowed? Did she put things in her mouth? Needles, while she was sewing? Pins, coins, anything like that? Seeds? Did she ever eat watermelon? Sometimes the appendix?" "No." Steve shook his head wearily. "I don't know. It was just a thought." Dr. Blair drove slowly off down the narrow tree-lined street, leaving two dark streaks, two soiled lines that marred the pale, glistening snow. Spring came, warm and sunny. The ground turned black and rich. Overhead the sun shone, a hot white orb, full of strength. "Stop here," Steve murmured. Ed Patterson brought the car to a halt at the side of the street. He turned off the motor. The two men sat in silence, neither of them speaking. At the end of the street children were playing. A high school boy was mowing a lawn, pushing the machine over the wet grass. The street was dark in the shade of the great trees growing along each side. "Nice," Ed said. Steve nodded without answering. Moodily, he watched a young girl walking by, a shopping bag under her arm. The girl climbed the stairs of a porch and disappeared into an old-fashioned yellow house. Steve pushed the car door open. "Come on. Let's get it over with." Ed lifted the wreath of flowers from the back seat and put them in his son's lap. "You'll have to carry it. It's your job." "All right." Steve grabbed the flowers and stepped out onto the pavement. The two men walked up the street together, silent and thoughtful. "It's been 7 or 8 months, now," Steve said abruptly. "At least." Ed lit the cigar as they walked along, puffing clouds of gray smoke around them. "Maybe a little more. I never should have brought her up here. She lived in town all her life. She didn't know anything about the country. It would have happened anyhow. If we had been closer to a hospital. The doctor said it wouldn't have made any difference. Even if we'd called him right away instead of waiting until morning." They came to the corner and turned. "And as you know." "Forget it," Steve said, suddenly tense. The sounds of the children had fallen behind them. The houses had thinned out. Their footsteps rang out against the pavement as they walked along. "We're almost there," Steve said. They came to a rise. Beyond the rise was a heavy brass fence, running the length of a small field. A green field, neat and even. with carefully placed plaques of white marble crisscrossing it. Here we are, Steve said tightly. They keep it nice. Can we get in from this side? We can try. Ed started along the brass fence, looking for a gate. Suddenly Steve halted, grunting. He stared across the field, his face white. Look. What is it? Ed took off his glasses to see. What you looking at? I was right. Steve's voice was low and indistinct. I thought there was something. Last time we were here. I saw. You see it? I'm not sure. I see the tree, if that's what you mean. In the center of the neat green field the lime apple tree rose proudly. Its bright leaves sparkled in the warm sunlight. The young tree was strong and very healthy. It swayed confidently with the wind, its supple trunk moist with sweet spring sap. They're red, Steve said softly. They're already red. How the hell can they be red? It's only April. How the hell can they be red so soon? I don't know, Ed said. I don't know anything about apples. A strange chill moved through him. But graveyards always made him uncomfortable. Maybe we ought to go. Her cheeks were that color, Steve said, his voice low. When she had been running. Remember? The two men gazed uneasily at the little apple tree, its shiny red fruit glistening in the spring sunlight, branches moving gently with the wind. I remember, all right, Ed said grimly. Come on. He took his son's arm insistently, the wreath of flowers forgotten. Come on, Steve. Let's get out of here.